Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
The beginnings of a future pirate king. What if Luffy was never entrusted to Garp, but instead raised by Whitebeard? Follow a different journey where Luffy grows up surrounded by one of the most legendary pirate crews in the world. Chaos, laughter, brotherhood, and belonging await, all while Luffy still dreams of becoming the king of the pirates. Big shout out to the warlords of this channel: Rodarius Jones, Native Warrior, Claude Lifrace, Neo Wesker 23, Derek Doughty, Zazu Saez, Abdul Raf Ali, N3WT, What If Lord, Black Money Young Leon, Garrick Russell, Case Clark, KSGPL4YZ, and Brian McKenzie. You know who you are. Want to stand among legends? Join the channel membership and show your support. Adios.
What are we going to do? Sabo said from beside Ace, who just had his hands behind his head, walking lazily back towards the village they had come from originally. Going to do? Nothing, that's what we'll do. He probably told the guy he's from the Whitebeard crew and the jerk let him go. He's probably running back to his mommy Marco to cry. Ace rolled his eyes at the thought. I mean who would mess with a crew the size of Whitebeard's? Sabo said, relaxing. Ace was probably right. I mean, the kid didn't look that smart, but even he would know to say a name from that crew. Walking back to the village in silence, the boys couldn't wait to look through all of their treasure and really put together how much they can probably make on the Grand Line. When they arrived in the village, everything seemed normal, so the boys didn't really think about anything. They wandered around and used a small amount of their fortune to buy snacks and things they might find useful. Hey Ace, over here, Sabo called from a shop nearby. The shop was selling cheap items and the tall pipes had caught his eye. He said, coming over to see what got Sabo so excited. Aren't you boys a little too young to be looking at such things? An old man shopkeeper said, but stepped back by the glare Ace gave him. Pipes? He asked Sabo, who nodded his head excitedly. Yeah, just like back home. He missed having the feel of his pipe in his hand. He saw one in Luffy's room as well back on the ship and considered stealing it, but thought against it when Marco gave him a dirty look for even touching it slightly. Ace nodded his head in understanding. He missed holding a weapon as well. This way we can protect ourselves if need be. Sabo continued on with excitement. The shopkeeper, sensing a sale, jumped right into action. They're also coated with sea stone. You never know what type of fruit user you might run into around here, so it's always good to have a little bit on you just in case, he said, pointing to the tips of the pipes that had a slick, shiny look to them but felt gritty to touch. We'll take them, was all the boys said before handing a large chunk of their funds over to the man with a smile. Sure, they knew they had given away part of their treasure fund, but it was worth it to get a weapon again. Hey boys, having fun? Thatch asked, coming into view with a bottle of alcohol in his hands. Look at what we got, Sabo said, pointing to his pipe. Thatch grinned, glad to have one of the brats opening up to him even if the others still remained closed off. Looks great, maybe we'll start training you both with Luffy, he said in excitement. He liked training Luffy, and with others there the kid might learn faster. New pipes, huh? Where's Luffy, yo? Marco came around the corner and walked into the conversation, looking around for the hyperball named Luffy. Ace and Sabo's eyes widened at the missing child, who they were sure would go running to Marco. I'll go get him, Sabo said, taking a step back and pulling Ace with him, who started to pale. Marco raised his eyebrow in suspicion. You don't think Sabo said, running back towards the path that led to the other village. He wouldn't have. He can't be that stupid. Ace was panicking. It had been hours since they left him alone in that forest. 6 freaking hours to be exact. They ran as fast as they could towards where they might find the little boy. Hours earlier, so brat, all you need to do is tell us where your little friends are and I'll let you go, said the man with an evil grin. Luffy looked him right in the eyes and said, never. Annoyed at the child, he picked up a large hammer and brought it crashing down on his head, where it wiggled for a moment then bounced off. That won't work. I ate the Gomu Gomu, no I'm a rubber man, Luffy said in annoyance. Sure, that didn't actually hurt, but that didn't mean he liked it. I see, an actual fruit user. "Hey, tie him up and get my gloves," he said, pointing at Luffy, who was now being tied from the rafters just dangling in the air. The man returned, then took one look at Luffy, grabbed him by the hair, bringing him to his face. "Tell us where they are, kid, or you'll never see anyone again." Luffy once more looked the man in the eyes and screamed. "Never." Snorting at him, he pushed Luffy back, allowing him to swing back towards him, and with his spiked glove he punched Luffy in the face. Blood flew from the impact and Luffy began to shake. No one had ever hit him before, and whenever he did get hurt, someone was always there to help him. "Ouch! That hurt. Someone help me." He started to cry out, making the man angry, who then took another swing at Luffy. Hours passed and Luffy was covered in blood. His body was shaking and tears still filled his eyes. "Tell me," the man shouted in his face. Luffy looked up at him once more with bright eyes that refused to be broken. "I won't say, I won't say, I won't say," he chanted like a mantra, making the man punch him more and more, but Luffy refused to sell out the two boys. Once the man figured that Luffy wasn't going to talk, he threw the gloves across the room. "Fine, no more," he said softly, walking away from Luffy towards a sword that was leaning against a wall. Luffy looked up at the man and felt sad. Was this how he was going to die? He wished he had told Marco and Pops that he loved them a bit more. Hearing the man drag the sword across the room, Luffy closed his eyes and more tears fell. "Then die," the man said, bringing the sword up to Luffy's level and bringing it back to swing when the walls shattered and Ace and Sabo came crashing in. "Stop it," they shouted, bringing their pipes down on the unsuspecting man and his gang of pirates. "Sabo, get Luffy down from there," Ace shouted, holding his pipe in a defensive position while Sabo went to work helping the kid down. "Easy there, Luffy," he said softly to the child who didn't even have enough strength to move. Ace was fighting off a bunch of people at once and was being severely outmatched, but only by the numbers, not by the strength. When the man that had tortured Luffy grabbed Ace by the collar and lifted him into the air, Luffy called out for Ace and Sabo knew he needed to step in. "You stay here," he said to Luffy before going to stand up when he felt himself being pushed back down. In came two older men standing protectively in front of Luffy and Sabo, while one of them had their hand on the one holding Ace's shoulder. "If you know what's good for you, you'll put the kid down." The man holding Ace's eyes widened at the sight of Commander Thatch. Marco's blue eyes were shadowed and angry. This was the first time he had ever seen anyone so angry before. "White-beard pirates," the stupid man said softly and looked at the kids before laughing. "How the old man has fallen to take on such pathetic children." He laughed hysterically and threw Ace to the ground, making the kid grunt. The man didn't even see it coming when Marco moved in swiftly and broke his neck. He had never felt so angry before. He knew something was up with those kids, so he and Thatch followed them just in case. When they heard Luffy was being held somewhere, he wanted to burn the island to the ground. No one touched his brother, not now, not ever. When they saw the boys go crashing into the room, Marco wanted to join them, but Thatch held him back. "Let's see how they handle things first." Or at least that was the plan until Marco saw Luffy. His little Luffy was covered in blood and shaking in fear. He lost it. He wanted the blood of the monster that did this, and he would have it. Turning now, he saw Luffy holding onto the other kid with a firm grip and a soft smile. Sabo returned the smile to him. "Let's go," Thatch said, picking Ace up and putting him on his back. Ace tried to struggle, not used to being held, but Thatch held him in place. Marco picked up Luffy very carefully and felt him snuggle into his arms, falling asleep instantly. It had been a really bad day. There was silence during the walk for a long time, but Marco finally had enough. "Why Yoi? I'm trained. We made a mistake," Sabo said softly, but that wasn't good enough for Marco. "He trusts so easily. He wanted to be with you all the time. He even said he hated me because I tried to separate him from you. Why would you leave a child alone with a man you didn't know? Why didn't you come find one of us sooner, Yoi?" Marco didn't even realize he had been shouting until Sabo flinched. "We thought he would escape and go to you," Sabo said quietly, knowing it wasn't an excuse. "It's fine now. All three of you are safe and sound," Thatch said. Marco was still angry but knew now wasn't the time to take it out on children years younger than himself. "Everyone makes mistakes," Thatch said knowingly to the kids. Ace was silent but was watching the sleeping boy the whole time. Luffy hadn't ratted them out. He had been beaten and nearly killed but refused to rat them out. He would never say it out loud, but his respect for the boy had started to grow, even just a little bit. Once they reached the ship, it was starting to get dark and the boys had missed dinner, so understandably everyone was worried. Pops got up from his chair to greet his sons home when he spotted Luffy in Marco's arms. "Who has harmed your brother?" he said softly, sadly, but everyone could feel the anger. Luffy's shirt was ripped and covered in his own blood. Seeing him like this really upset the older man. "It's been taken care of and will never happen again, Yui," Marco said, looking towards the two boys. "Take him to the infirmary. When he wakes up, I'll have a cook bring him some dinner. You boys also go rest. Food will be there when you are ready." Pops directed them to the infirmary, where they were checked over by the head nurse. She deemed Sabo healthy but needing rest. Ace had a mild concussion and would need to stay overnight to make sure he was fine in the morning. Luffy was heavily bandaged and cleaned up. Myra shook her head, her lips pulled into a thin line, but didn't say anything. When Luffy was tucked into a bed and everyone resting, Marco sat down and watched them. They were just children who have probably suffered and had no idea what to do in that situation. He felt guilty for yelling at Sabo, but he shook his head. All three were safe, and that was all that mattered. He leaned back in his chair and fell asleep. When Luffy woke up, he saw two faces looking at him. Sabo smiled, but Ace just watched him carefully. Marco also woke around that time but decided to pretend he was asleep, curious as to what might happen. "How are you doing?" Sabo asked him cautiously, not sure how the kid might react. "I'm sore but all alive," he said, giving his big smile. Ace gripped his hands into fists and stood up quickly. "Why didn't you just tell them where we were in the first place?" he shouted towards Luffy. Marco had to use all of his willpower just to hold himself in place. Luffy put his hat on his head and looked down, shadowing his eyes, his lower lip pulled up in a sad pout. "If I had said anything, you wouldn't want to be my friend," he said, holding back his tears. Ace just lifted his hand up and pointed at Luffy. "It's better than dying, isn't it? Why do you want to become my friend that much?" Ace said in confusion and anger. "Because," Luffy started, and Marco's heart just broke hearing that tone of voice come from Luffy. It was so sad. "Didn't we give you such a hard time till now? Why would you follow us this far?" Ace's voice had grown softer, sounding more confused than angry now. Luffy sniffled a bit and trying to hold back his tears that were due to fall. Because I have no one else," he shouted. Marco forced himself to relax, but even Sabo and Ace were startled about that proclamation. "Marco and Thatch are always really busy and Pops sometimes doesn't feel good, so I can't bother him. If I didn't follow you guys, I'd be all alone. Being lonely hurts more than being hurt." Luffy let the tears fall this time. Marco was panicking. He really wanted to hug Luffy, tell him it was alright. He had no idea that Luffy was feeling this way at all. "But you're surrounded by a lot of people," Ace said, slightly confused and a bit taken aback. But they're all older than me. There's no other kids on this ship," he said, looking straight at Ace. "Is it easy for you when I'm around?" he asked Luffy in a serious tone. He nodded his head. "It's harder without me?" he asked Luffy in the same voice. Luffy replied the same. Ace seemed to zone out at that point, and Sabo looked at him with sad eyes, knowing just what he was thinking about. "Do you want me to live?" he almost whispered, staring at Luffy expectantly, daring him to say no. Marco was thrown off by those words. What could have happened in this child's life to cause such a reaction? To make him wonder if he should have been born? For the second time that day, Marco felt like hurting the monster that caused this child pain. "Of course I do," Luffy shouted, making Marco smile softly. "I see, but I still hate stupid crybabies like you," Ace shouted at Luffy, who stood up. "I'm not a crybaby, I'm strong," he shouted back, glaring at Ace. "Right says the one who's crying," he taunted, making Sabo just sigh. "You try getting punched with a spiked glove for hours," Luffy replied before Sabo actually started to laugh. "You guys are so silly," he giggled out, making Ace blush in embarrassment, and Luffy just grinned. Luffy yawned and went back to his bed. Sabo grabbed the now flustered Ace and led him over to the bed, where they snuggled in and fell asleep. Marco opened his eyes and watched the children. Thatch submerged from the shadows with a sad smile. "I like them," he said. Marco just sighed. "They've been hurt, severely, Yoi," he whispered, trying not to wake them. "And Luffy was feeling lonely," Thatch replied in the same whisper. "Why didn't we see it, Yoi?" Marco asked, looking at his small brother. "Because he's always smiling," Common, let's let them be. Tomorrow will be another day and I have a feeling things are about to change. Thatch said, him and Marco heading out of the infirmary together, closing the door softly. It was morning and Luffy was ready to start his day the way he usually did, with a large breakfast. Jumping out of bed and quickly throwing his cloths on, he raced from the room towards the amazing smell. Slow down there, buddy, the food's not going anywhere, Doba said with a smile, patting him on the head, sitting in front of him at the table. His monkey made a chattering sound in reply as well. Luffy just stuffed his face more, not listening to anything or anyone. He loved food so much after all. When he finished eating as fast as he could, he ran outside to see if someone would play with him. The commanders were getting everyone in order to start fixing and cleaning the ship since they had a battle the night before. Marco, can we go flying? He said excitedly. He hadn't been flying in a while and was starting to miss the wind through his hair. Not now, buddy, I got a lot of work to organize here, then more to get finished later. How about other time, Yoi? Marco picked the hat dangling from Luffy's neck and placed it on his head in a sort of apology. MNN. He said with a smile, knowing how busy his big brother can get. Deciding the next person he should ask was Thatch, he ran off towards where the man usually was. Thatch was heading out of the kitchen to deliver snacks to the crew members in his division that were working hard. Thatchy, tell me a story. Luffy went running to the man, colliding with his leg in a hug. Thatch laughed and patted him on the head. Can't right now, bud. I've got to make sure my division is motivated enough to work. He smiled a sheepish grin down at the disappointed boy. How about we play a bit later, K? He said. Luffy gave his biggest grin in return and ran towards his father. He was in need of a story and Pops was always ready to give one, that's for sure. When Luffy got to where Whitebeard always was, he felt his smile falter at the empty chair. Walking towards a nurse who was gathering all of the equipment for the older man, Luffy tugged on her shirt. Nay, where's Pops? He said in concern. She smiled sadly at the little boy. Pops isn't feeling well today, Lou. He needs to rest so he can be strong again later, alright. She really needed her father to get the rest he needed. The battle the night before had worn the older man down a bit. Moke, he said, but smiled anyways, running off towards another victim, hoping someone would play with him. It turned out everyone was busy doing something. Even though the ship was always fun, they were still pirates and chores had to be finished to keep the ship going. Luffy felt his eyes burn with tears unshed. He had hundreds of siblings but not one could sit down and play with him. He felt so lonely. Woof. Luffy looked up suddenly from the floor he had taken refuge on to see Steven sitting in front of him now. Woof woof, he said, licking Luffy's leg, making the boy giggle. You're my friend, right, Steven? Luffy asked the dog, who replied with a woof. I wish I had other friends. I mean, I like having Ma and Thatchy and Pops. But I wish. I just want someone to talk to. Someone who could play like I do and be like me. Ya know? He cried a bit to the dog that just cuddled up with him. Sorry, I won't be sad anymore, promise. I'll laugh again tomorrow. I'll smile again tomorrow, but today, he let his smile fall completely off his face and buried himself in Steven's fun. I just want to be sad for today, he mumbled, closing his eyes and falling asleep right there. Sure, Luffy had everything here on the Moby, family that loved him, a father that cherished him, and Marco that would always watch over him. What he really wanted though was someone he could freely talk to. Someone who could take away his loneliness, because after all, being lonely hurt more than anything in the world, and he never wanted to be alone. What you doing over here, Yoi? Marco said, standing over a sleeping 7-year-old with his face buried into a sleeping Steven's fur. Sleep in, go away, he mumbled out, snuggling deeper into the warm fur. Marco chuckled at that before he bent down and whispered. You'll miss dinner, Yoi. And with those words, Luffy was awake and standing. Food, he shouted happily. Let's go eat, Brad. I was starting to worry, Thatch said, coming around the corner and grinning at the pair. MNN, he grabbed Marco's hand and then took Thatch's hand, and they all smiled, walking towards the galley, Luffy's loneliness forgotten for now. XX. Luffy, would you come here for a moment? A girl named Hannah said. She was one of the nurses on the ship who would every so often slip a sucker to the boy, so he liked her. MNN. He said excitedly, hoping to get a sucker. We need your help, little man, she said, taking his hand and leading him towards the infirmary. Sure, he said, excited to be useful to someone. When Luffy entered the infirmary, he could feel the temperature drop even just a little bit. "What's going on?" he said, not quite sure why the nurses were staring at him like that. An evil smirk came from them all before they jumped him, tearing his clothing off. Luffy couldn't help but scream in fear. Everyone on the ship heard his scream and raised their eyebrows, not quite sure what was going on. When Luffy opened his eyes, he had a fancy outfit on him. His red shirt with a clip-on tie matched with his black vest that buttoned up to his chest. His dark pants with a small chain hooked at his belt made him look quite handsome, or at least that's what the ladies were gushing about. "I knew it. He looks amazing in this outfit," one of the nurses screamed in delight. "We should put him in a kimono next," another shouted excitedly. "No, we should try this cute animal onesie." One of them came forward holding up a new outfit. What's going on?" He started to back away in worry. "We have decided to teach you about fashion, Luffy. It's a must in this world. You can't wear the same thing all the time, you know. Though that isn't that important for the moment," the nurse Hannah said to him, getting on his eye level. "Do you know what day it is today, Luffy?" He thought about it for 1 second before his head started to hurt. "No, he said, shaking his head in confusion. The nurse giggled and blushed before saying with cheer, "It is Valentine's Day." She grinned and the other nurses were smiling happily as well. "Valentine? Who's that?" he said, confused. He didn't know anyone named Valentine. "Valentine, Luffy, it's a day where people express their love," a nurse said, coming forward to talk to Luffy. "Express love?" He tilted his head, making the girls coo at his cuteness. "MN, we want you to help us give out chocolates to everyone," she said, poking his nose. "Chocolates? Aw. But Marco will become a cranky bastard. He doesn't like chocolates," Luffy said, remembering how Marco didn't seem to like candy being on the ship. "I think he will give in today, especially if you go looking like that." They all grinned at his suit and tie look. And with that they gave Luffy a medium-sized bag that he could carry but not too heavy for him, filled with small wrapped chocolates. "Now Luffy, I want you to hand them to everyone, okay? When you do though, remember to say, Happy Valentine's Day. Got that?" He nodded his head, excited to go and give the presents. The nurses gave him the thumbs up and he started. The moment Luffy walked out on deck, he caught attention. He was wearing something very different than normal, and while it did make him look very sharp, it was still weird coming from him. Luffy spotted a random crew member, marched right up to him, plopped his bag on the ground, then handed a chocolate to him. "Happy Valentine Day," he said with his grin. The member looked at the chocolate before grabbing Luffy into a big hug. "Thanks, bud." Luffy laughed and waved goodbye, continuing on his way. He stopped every member he came across, saying his words and giving his gift. The crew was in a very cheerful mood and he was getting from everyone. "Marco!" Luffy yelled in delight, seeing his brother talking to Pops. The said man turned and smiled at Luffy, who was running towards him. "Marco, here, Happy Valentine Day." He handed Marco a chocolate and climbed over to Pops and did the exact same thing. "Do you mean Valentine's Day?" Pops asked with a grin. "MN, that word." Marco laughed along with the old man. "The nurses must have coned you into this, Yoi," he said, looking at the outfit Luffy was wearing. "Coned?" he asked, not quite sure what that word meant. "Talked you into this. The clothes do look good on you though, Yoi," he said, looking at the outfit his little brother was wearing. "They wanted to dress me up funny," he shouted, throwing his arms in the air. "Gurara. I bet they did," Pop said with his smile. Luffy laughed back before waving his hands in farewell, heading off to continue his chocolate giveaway. Marco was never fond of chocolate, but chocolate from his family was the best. Since the two boys were not used to the Grand Line's weather yet, the Whitebeard pirates decided to make smaller stops around Paradise to help build up their immune systems. Of course, Luffy whined about this for a while, wanting to hit Fishman Island as soon as possible and return to what he knows, but the looks Ace and Sabo gave him shut him up quickly. The boys had grown ever closer since the time on that island. Sabo had included Luffy into their friendship and even hung out with him in the galley. Mostly it was to just talk and listen to Luffy tell stories about their adventures every once in a while. Ace was still refusing to completely accept Luffy, but that didn't mean he didn't like the kid. In fact, he actually did like him. Ace would scowl and scoff whenever Luffy was around, but when the kid turned his back, Ace would give Luffy a fond smile, one that didn't go unnoticed by Marco. Luffy had accepted Ace. He wanted Ace to live without even knowing why he felt the need not to. Ace wanted to protect that kindness no matter what, of course, though he'd never admit it out loud. Marco had come to accept that these kids would be a part of Luffy's life from now on. Luffy had decided that they would all be sharing a room from that day forth and began this decision by gathering up all of their things and helping them move into his bigger room. Marco had hoped that the Scowling One would refuse this decision, but instead he agreed to it. All he could do was sigh and hope for the best at this point in time. Things began to get worse for Marco as each time the boys left the ship all three would return in worse shape than when they left. Luffy was starting to wear hospital bandages as if they were a new fashion trend, and one the nurses weren't too fond of. But of course Luffy would just smile his large grin whenever Marco asked him what he was doing and say, "Secret shishi," before running off towards his friends in happiness. Marco didn't quite know what to do with himself. Luffy was keeping secrets from his family, and that was something new that he didn't like. Luffy felt bad. He wanted to tell Marco what was happening, but he promised Ace and Sabo he wouldn't ever tell a soul what he knew. One day when they ran off to a new town to visit, Ace separated from them to wander on his own. Sabo said that was fine and he probably just needed space. Luffy wasn't so sure about that but felt that Sabo wouldn't lie to him, so he let it go. He followed Sabo around while Marco and the others gathered supplies. There was only going to be a few more Paradise Islands before they went back home. While they were walking, Sabo was growing increasingly worried as the time flew by. "Maybe we should go find Ace, nay?" Sabo asked Luffy, who was just watching a few bugs on the ground. "MN," he cheered, standing up straight and following his friend in hopes to find Ace. It was like his own mini-adventure. When the boys walked into a bar where they thought Thatch might be to ask him if he had seen Ace, they were surprised to find Ace actually there. "Hey!" Ace started while walking up to a bunch of drunks. They looked up at him in confusion. "What would you do if Gold Roger had a kid?" he asked, his fists gripped tight. The man scoffed and laughed, causing the entire bar to start laughing. Sabo pushed Luffy behind him, muttering, "Oh no. He'd be better off dead. Nothing more, a monster, a demon that wouldn't deserve to live." The drunk man laughed, making Ace angrier. "Why's Ace so mad?" Luffy asked innocently. "Because Gold Roger is Ace's dad," Sabo said without thinking to Luffy, whose eyes widened in surprise then began to sparkle in excitement. "Wow. Really? That's so cool." Luffy started to freak before Sabo realized what he had said. "Shish, don't mention that at all to Ace," he said, panicking. "But why?" he asked innocently. "Because Ace hates his father, that's why," Sabo stated with heat, knowing it would be his head for telling the kid, especially since he couldn't lie and was very close with the pirate crew. "That's weird." Luffy laughed cheerfully, making Ace look their way. He gave Sabo a glare in question before bringing his fist back and slamming it into the drunk's face. "Damn it, you stay here," he said before jumping into batter right behind Ace. Luffy, not one to listen, jumped right on in with Sabo fists flying in every direction, hitting anyone he could. "Oi! I told you to stay there," Sabo said, knocking down another guy while Luffy just laughed his head off. One man pulled a blade and sliced Luffy's arm, making the kid stop laughing and glare at the man. Ace heard Luffy hiss in pain and brought his foot onto the man's head, knocking him out. Realizing that they weren't going to get anything else, the trio fled the scene. Going to a forest to rest where people wouldn't think to look for them, Luffy showed his bloody arm to Ace, who only sighed. Sabo, always prepared, pulled some bandages out of his pockets and started to wrap it up. "That won't fix it, but it will stop the bleeding for now until the doctor lady sees it," he said, smiling at the work he had done. "Why did you get so angry, Ace?" Luffy asked him with a tilted head. "Doesn't matter," he shouted, not looking at his friends. Is it because Gold Roger's your dad?" Luffy asked him with the same head tilt, which made Ace turn around so fast and hit the kid on the head. "Don't say that bastard's name," he said in complete anger, then gave a glare at Sabo, who was whistling, not looking at the fight going on. "But you know all about me. Why can't I know about you?" Luffy shouted back, nursing his sore head. "HMMPH. Ace just pouted in return. "It is kind of true, Ace. We have been learning everything about this guy. It's only fair he learned a little about us." Sabo smiled at the look Ace was giving until he saw that Ace was smiling rather weirdly. "Right, and since you so kindly told him about me, why don't you tell him something about you?" He smirked at his paling friend. "I am not that interesting," Sabo stammered out, catching Luffy's attention. "Oh, so your family isn't special or anything?" Ace said, smirking still at Sabo. Fine, he shouted, closing his eyes. Luffy, I come from a noble family. He shouted at the kid who only began to pick his nose. So, Luffy asked, feeling disappointed. He thought that Sabo might have a cool dad as well. You don't care? Sabo looked at the kid, his eyes softening. Pops says that everyone is the child of the sea. He repeated the phrase Pops had once told him. Luffy, Ace. Sabo stood up and pointed to them. Someday when we're older we'll sail the seas. There will be no one freer than us, he said excitedly. Ace grinned before standing up himself. Someday I will make people remember my name, even if it's through fear they will know me and that I was born. He shouted, feeling lighter. Luffy, catching on to what was happening, also stood up, nodded his head in understanding, took a deep breath and said, I will become the king of the pirates. He shouted for the whole world to hear. Both Sabo and Ace looked startled at that proclamation. Of all the things you would say, Ace sighed, rubbing his forehead. Ha ha ha. You're a funny guy, Luffy. I can't wait to see what the future holds for you. He smiled and they all walked back to the ship with a grin on their faces, feeling closer than ever. When they got back to the ship and Marco saw the bandage on Luffy's arm, he immediately looked at the two beside him. Care to explain, Yoi? Luffy laughed at the scene. That was actually my fault, she, he said, making Marco feel even more worried. Fine, just go get cleaned up, Yoi. He sighed, watching Luffy and the two boys run off to the infirmary. Don't look so sad, Marco. Pop said from his chair. Marco made his way over to sit by his father. I feel like he doesn't need me as much anymore. He doesn't even come to me when he's had a nightmare or even to cuddle like he used to. I feel like I'm losing him, Yoi. Marco said to the older man sadly, but Whitebeard smiled softly. All children must grow, but that doesn't mean he will now need you for support rather than attention. He still loves you. Marco is his eldest brother. Why not try and get to know the other two? Get to see why he likes them so much and maybe you will understand him better. Whitebeard said to Marco, who smiled, standing up and brushing himself off before walking to the infirmary to check on his brothers. He corrected himself. Pops was right. In the time he had been moping about not having time with Luffy, he had never really tried to get to know the two other brats around him. That was about to change. From this day on he would learn about them and try his hardest to see them through Luffy's eyes. And while Luffy was smiling with them, he couldn't help but smile back. Luffy was Luffy no matter who he was with. He brought the sunshine. Ace had woken up early that morning with dozens thoughts racing through his head. He, Sabo, and Luffy had all decided that they were going to share the bed that Luffy originally had to himself. Ace looked towards his sleeping friends and knew that out of all the people in the world, the two people right there beside him could be trusted to their cores. Now, Ace was not normally one to show his affections for others, but he felt he absolutely had to show them the trust he put in each of them. And, after thinking about it for days on end, he had come up with a way. Ace slowly crept out of bed and tried to quietly leave the cabin, hoping since it was still dark out that everyone was asleep. Thankfully, he could tell by how quiet the ship was that no one was up yet. Using the stealth he had learned while sneaking up on animals bigger than himself, he made his way to the galley. He looked around the large kitchen, thankful that the cooks kept the place clean. Not at all like Dayton, who shuddered at the mere mention of the words, clean, and organized. He climbed up on the counters, opening cupboard door after cupboard door in search of something in particular. Each time he opened a door, he would close it just as quietly, hoping that no one heard the soft squeak the hinges sometimes made. Opening a door closer to the corner of the kitchen, he finally found what he had been looking for, a bottle of sake. Grabbing it excitedly, he gently put it down on the counter and hopped down. He smiled widely, looking at the drink. This was exactly what he needed. Now if he could just find something to drink from, everything would be perfect. After rifling through several drawers nearby, he found 3 red sake. Sakazuki practically begging him to take them. Seeing his plan come together made the boy even more excited. His smile practically split his face. Pocketing the dishes and holding the bottle tight, he raced back to the room to put his plan into action. Thatch watched from the shadows, his brow raised. He had woken up early, as per his usual routine, to plan out the crew's meals for the day, only to find a 10-year-old child stealing a bottle of sake from his kitchen. The kid had guts to steal from the chef of the Whitebeard pirates. He'd give him that. He could have easily stepped out from his observation point and stopped Ace, of course, but his curiosity as to why a child wanted a bottle of booze outweighed his anger. As such, he decided to simply wait and see how things went. Marco, of course, wasn't going to be told anything. An angry Marco was the last thing he needed. An overprotective brother was never a good thing, especially if somebody his little brother liked to associate was misbehaving with Sake. No, it would be best to just wait this out and see what happened for himself. It was a bit less than an hour later, Luffy and Sabo woke up. As they did, they saw Ace sitting by the door, a huge grin on his face. "What's with that look? It's too early for your craziness," Sabo sighed, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "I was planning on doing this on the next island, but I can't wait." "Luffy, get up or you'll miss something good," Ace said and called to the little boy who shot up looking around excitedly. "Is it a new type of food?" he asked, searching excitedly around him, making Sabo laugh. "Nope, something better." Ace grinned and placed the 3 cups in a circle in front of him. Luffy jumped off the bed and sat in front of a cup while Sabo looked at the other in confusion. "Did you know that when men drink together they become brothers?" Ace smiled, carefully pouring the sake in the 3 cups so as not to spill any. "Brothers?" Luffy asked in wonder. "MNN." He responded with a smile. "From today on we shall now be called brothers," Ace said, picking up his cup and toasting it with Luffy and Sabo. The 3 chugged it down quickly, ignoring the sudden burning through their throats. "Someday we may not be crewmates on the same ship, but no matter where we go, we will be bonded by our bond of brotherhood," Ace said, putting his glass down, looking at his friends, no brothers in pure happiness. Thatch, who had been listening in with his observation haki, couldn't stop the large tear that made its way down his face. His family was expanding, and growing even closer. Putting on a large grin, he made his way to the galley to cook up a fabulous breakfast to honor the new brothers, his new brothers. Line break: Marco had been keeping a lookout on some ships coming their way. He had spotted them an hour ago and signaled the crew just in case. Of course they were probably super weak, but still, it was never a fun thing dealing with the piddly little pirate crews who thought they had some chance at beating Pops. "Oi! The ships are approaching rather quickly now, and they've got a flag I don't recognize yet either, Yoi," Marco called down to a commander, who was quickly relayed the report to Pops. Whitebeard was entertaining his 3 youngest sons on his lap, telling them a story of one of his sea battles. Luffy was his usual cheerful and excited self, while Sabo paid close attention to everything that was being said. Ace seemed to feel uncomfortable being on the old man's lap, but he was happy nonetheless with his brothers beside him. "Pops, some ships have come into view and Marco doesn't know the Jolly Roger," the man said. Pops nodded his head and dismissed him. "Do I have to go below deck, Pops?" Luffy asked, feeling a bit worried. "No, my son, you can stay here this time. Those ships are small, so I doubt any danger will come from them." His words calmed Luffy down right away. After all, Pops was the strongest man in the whole world. Sabo looked excitedly curious. He had never seen real live pirate battle before. Sure, he had beaten up thugs with Ace, but small-time thugs were way different from rival pirates. Ace had the exact same thoughts and felt more excited than anything else. He couldn't wait for the battle to start. Pops continued with his story, Marco joining in and picking Luffy off of his father's lap, placing the kid on his own. Luffy snuggled in right away, happy to get cuddles. During the story, cannons were beginning to be fired from the other ship towards the Moby. Ace and Sabo were still on Pop's lap, so they were beyond safe, and Marco had firm grip on Luffy. Marco didn't move yet in spite of the cannon fire, since he knew one of his many siblings would help defend the ship when the time arose. When the closer ships began to fire and the ship began to rock, Luffy burrowed a bit deeper into Marco's chest, making the man hold him tighter, trying to calm him some. "It's all right, Lou. No one can hurt you while I'm here, Yoi." Ace hopped down from Whitebeard's lap and sat down beside Marco and Luffy, with Sabo following close behind. Sabo rubbed his little brother's back in soothing motions, and Ace just sat there watching the battle ensue, a protective aura surrounding the group. This was one of the first times Marco felt close to the other 2 boys. It was obvious that they cared for their new little brother just as much as he cared for Luffy. His eyes locked with Ace's for a moment, but that was all that was needed. Ace nodded his head at Marco and Marco nodded back, a new bond forming between the two. They both would protect their brothers to the best of their ability. Sabo smiled at his brother finally forming a connection with someone outside his current life. Marco stood up, feeling content leaving Luffy in the care of the two children, something he had never felt before. If he had the time, he might have stopped to contemplate the new feelings of trust that were building inside him. But their ship was under attack at the moment, so he had to simply file those thoughts away for later and be ready to defend his family. "I'm here to challenge Whitebeard," a man that appeared to be the captain called out. Thatch rolled his eyes and the others shook their heads, laughing at the thought of their father being defeated. Luffy looked on in interest but still held nervously onto Sabo's shirt. "Ooh, early to challenge me, brat," Whitebeard boomed. The man charged at him with his sword drawn and ready to attack. Whitebeard simply punched him, sending him flying into his ship fast enough to throw him through a wall. Luffy jumped up, finding his pops even cooler than ever now that he got to see him fight. "Wow, he really flew," Ace said, attempting to be cool about his surprise but clearly being impressed. "Gurarara, cheeky brat," Whitebeard bellowed with a grin. "Oi, what did you do to our captain?" a man from the rival ship demanded, jumping from his ship onto the Moby and pulling a gun from his sash. "Oh look, another idiot here to challenge Pops. Can't they just go away?" Aizu asked, feeling rather bored now that the captain was beaten. "I'll make you pay for that." He frantically aimed his gun at Whitebeard, who only frowned at the man in annoyance. The complete disinterest Whitebeard seemed to show outraged him beyond belief. Just before he pulled the trigger, he jerked the gun towards Whitebeard's feet, right where Luffy was watching. His eyes widened when he heard the bang of the gun being shot. Ace reacted instantly, shoving the kid to the ground as Vista deflected the bullet with the flick of his wrist. Marco's eyes narrowed in anger. How dare this man shoot towards his little brother? How dare he even shoot at a child? Marco gave Pops a look, asking for permission, but Whitebeard was already on top of the problem. He stood up straight, glaring down at the trembling opponent with his full height. "I thought your crew was here to challenge me," he stated, his voice booming, "and instead, you dared attack not only an unarmed, defenseless child, but my youngest son? Get off of my ship." The whole world shook for a moment as Whitebeard used his powers, sending the opposing ship flying along with all of its crew members. Kneeling down to look at Luffy, Pops did a quick look over to see if any damage had been done. "Luffy, are you alright?" he asked softly. MNN, his hands were shaking a bit, but other than that, he seemed okay. "I had my big brother here to protect me," he exclaimed, looking up at Ace. Ace grinned down at him, ruffling Luffy's hair affectionately. "Thank goodness. I'm glad you have two strong big brothers, Luffy Yoi," Marco said, giving Ace a fist bump in recognition. Ace returned it with a smile. Thatch's eyes widened at the scene. In only a short time, Marco had opened his heart to the other children and accepted them as his brothers. He relaxed a bit, knowing now that things were going to be alright. Ace had proven himself to all of them by protecting Luffy. He had earned his title as a brother and Thatch was going to start making use of that. Thatch had a plan. True, it wasn't one of his best or most well thought out plans. Nothing could top the Egg Day plan, but still, it was a plan. And every good plan needs proper planning to come together perfectly. He was writing a list of materials he was going to need to pull it off. While he was thinking about the finer details, Ace had come in looking for Luffy and Sabo. The Moby was a massive ship and gave the boys plenty of room to entertain themselves, so Luffy had decided to play hide and seek. Ace, failing at rock paper scissors, ended up being it, and had to count to 50 while his brothers ran off and hid. Now that he was done counting, he had wandered off to look for his brothers. Walking into the galley where he was sure Luffy would hide, he spotted Thatch leaning over on the counter, humming and writing things down. "What you doin'?" Ace asked, startling the man into dropping his pencil and covering the list with his hands. When Thatch realized that it was just one of the kids, he sighed in relief. He was afraid Marco would discover his secret plans. Still, he had to be cautious. Ace could blab to Luffy, Luffy would definitely blab to Marco, and then his whole plan would be ruined. "Hey, Brad. What are MUM doing?" he countered, subtly trying to cover up his list a bit more. Ace noticed and became curious. "Looking for Luffy and Sabo. We're playing hide and go seek," he answered innocently, leaning over a bit to try and see what was on the now completely covered list. Speaking of hiding and seeking, "What are ya hiding?" Ace asked, smirking a little. Thatch eyed the kid suspiciously. He knew the kid was getting on Marco's mother hen list, so he was wary to talk about his plan with the brat. Then again, "Promise not to tell anyone, not even Marco?" Thatch asked seriously, and Ace nodded his head. Thatch looked at him a little longer before picking him up and plopping him down on the counter beside him. He would be useful. "Have you ever pulled a prank before?" Thatch asked with a smirk. When Ace shook his head, "No," Thatch laughed loudly and ruffled the kid's hair. "Well then, it looks like I'll have to teach you, little brother," he said with a wide grin. Ace quickly forgot about his game of hide and seek altogether as he learned about this strange and exciting thing called pranking from his older brother. Line break Luffy was curled up in a ball, starting to feel incredibly bored. His epic hiding spot must have been too good if it was taking Ace this long to find him. And Luffy wasn't one for patience. 5 minutes or so passed by and Luffy had all but given up on his hiding. If Ace was taking this long, Luffy knew he was going to have to reteach his brother how to play hide and seek. "What are you doing under there, Yoi?" Marco asked, lifting up the blanket that Luffy had been hiding under. "I'm playing hide and seek with Ace and Sabo. Ace is seeking and I was hiding in my amazing hiding spot, but Ace sucks at being it and hasn't found me yet," Luffy answered in disappointment, grabbing the blanket and wrapping himself in it. "I don't think your hiding spot would have worked anyways, Luffy," Marco replied with a chuckle. "What are you talking about? My hiding spot's the best," Luffy pouted. Marco simply laughed. "I do wonder about that, Yoi." Luffy continued to pout at Marco, whose smile just grew. "I'm getting a bit hungry, how about you?" he asked, knowing that it would definitely distract his brother since Luffy was always hungry. "You bet I am," Luffy shouted, grabbing Marco's hand and letting the man lead him to the galley for food. When they arrived, however, Marco saw Thatch with his head low, whispering something Ace as they both wore massive grins. Stopping Luffy before he could enter the room, Marco motioned for Luffy to be super quiet. Marco tried to listen in on the near-silent conversation to find out which division was about to be pranked, hoping against hope that his own and the second were safe. He could deal with helping another commander clean up Thatch's mess, but cleaning up his own division plus the other one that was without a commander would be annoying. "Marco, food," Luffy whined, pulling on his hand in annoyance. Marco just patted his head and listened closely to Thatch. Hearing that his own division wasn't on the chopping block, he bent down to Luffy's level to talk to the kid eye to eye. "Luffy, your big brothers are about to do something really crazy. I think it's probably better that we don't bother them for the time being. How about we go play somewhere else for a bit, Yoi?" Marco asked, making the kid pout but nod and follow Marco anyways. He wanted a snack, but he knew dinner would be soon. He could wait just a little bit more. Heading back towards Luffy's amazing hiding spot, Marco grabbed the blanket and threw it around the kid's shoulders. Luffy looked at him in confusion before he was pulled into Marco's lap to cuddle for a loved cuddling. No matter who it was that was giving the cuddles. He thrived off of physical affection, and being hugged was one of his favorite things in the world, next to meat and his straw hat, of course. Sometimes, he would give hugs to everyone he came across just because he could. "Did you know that there are people who live in the sky, Yoi?" Marco asked. Luffy's eyes sparkled and he shook his head rapidly. Chuckling, he went on, "Well, there are people who live way up in the sky, on top of the clouds. It's very hard to get to them, but every once in a while when the sun hits the sky just right, you can see their shadows hanging over you." As Marco went on about these strange and miraculous people, Luffy was so absorbed that he didn't see Sabo walk by them looking for Ace. Line break to say that Sabo was annoyed would be a drastic understatement. In reality, he felt like might just kill Ace. They had been playing a game of hide and seek and Ace decided somewhere along the way that he wasn't going to look for them. Sabo had waited in his spot for what felt like hours, but was actually closer to 20 minutes, for Ace to find him, but he never did. He came out of hiding to find Luffy had come to the same conclusion that Ace wasn't looking for them anymore and had curled up on Marco's lap to listen to a story. Sabo thought of joining them, but saw the way the two were deeply in their own world with just the two of them. He felt it would be rude to interrupt them, so he left. Sabo continued to wander around the ship in hopes of finding Ace so he could vent his frustration. And by vent his frustration, he meant beat the ever-loving crap out of the little bastard beating up Ace would definitely relieve his frustration. It always did. As he was muttering to himself about how stupid Ace was, he caught sight of the 8th Division commander, Namur. Namur was talking with others in his division when he spotted Sabo looking his way. He didn't know why the boy was watching him, but he figured it might be due to the way he looked. Being a fish man, he was used to be stared at, although usually it didn't happen too often at home. Beckoning Sabo over, he saw the kid blush in embarrassment at being caught staring, but he came over anyways. Have you seen Ace at all? Sabo stuttered, unsure of what to say after being caught. Namur laughed good-naturedly. I can't say that I have. Word on the ship is that Thatch is up to something big, though, so perhaps he too took cover, Namur suggested. He knew Thatch was going to do something at breakfast when the man was humming at the table. That was usually everyone's first sign to either duck and cover or find out what he had done before it caused more trouble. Sabo merely nodded, still staring at the fishman. Is it true that the fishmen have their own island? Sabo blurted out. I know Luffy says there is, but I was just wondering, he added, attempting to regain his dignity. It's true, it's a beautiful place where many pirates stop before entering the New World, Namur stated matter-of-factly. He was very proud of his home and how it was under PW. That's amazing. So there must be many pirates that the island has seen. How do they keep it so safe? Sabo asked, his eyes turning towards Namur. Namur smiled, enjoying the curiosity of the little one. The island is under Pop's protection. No one would dare go against him, so those who travel to the island know to be good or face his wrath. Namur laughed, prompting Sabo to join in his amusement. You seem to like pirates, kid. I figured you'd want to be a marine being Garp's grandchild. Namur stated, looking at the kid as Sabo grimaced. That old geezer's not my grandpa, Sabo exclaimed, slightly confusing Namur as it was not what he had heard, but he accepted it. I like pirates because they're free, Sabo continued, his eyes looking sad and distant, as if remembering a misfortune of the past. Namur thought a child his age was too young to be inflicted with such sadness and felt the need to take it away from him. And if you became a pirate, that would make you free? Namur asked him seriously. Yes, sir. Pirates can do as they please with no one to hold them back. I just want to sail the seas and write about my adventures for the world to remember someday. Sabo smiled. His grin wasn't quite up to Luffy's standard, in how big or bright it was, but it sure brought a light of its own to the ship. MNN. Namur hummed, smiling at the kid. He knew that he was going to enjoy having this brat on board. Being on a ship full of cutthroats and brigands, even though they were the best and most loved ones around, being his family, he didn't often get the opportunity to engage in any semblance of intellectual conversation. With this remarkably intelligent child, he would definitely be getting that opportunity much more often. He felt like he knew that he would greatly enjoy this brat's presence on the ship. Line break when dinner rolled around. Luffy was telling Sabo all about the people in the sky. Sabo listened because he knew Marco must have been the one to tell him this tale. Once he finished listening to Luffy, he saw that Ace and Thatch had finally entered the galley to eat their dinner, laughing their heads off of it, something they only seemed to know. Sabo, feeling his temper rise, waited for Ace to sit down beside Luffy before standing up and punching the back of his head. Ouch! What the hell, Sabo? Ace asked, turning around fast in his seat. That's for ditching our game and making me wait for an hour, he growled. It was actually 20 minutes, Ace's eyes widened, remembering that he was supposed to be it. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, he stated nonchalantly, turning to his food. Sabo just closed his eyes, twitching in irritation. You really suck at games, Ace, Luffy added offhandedly, stealing a piece of Sabo's dinner. Well, we'll have to work on that now, won't we? Thatch said, putting an arm around Ace's shoulders and giving the kid a grin. Ace laughed at the idea before his head dropped right into his mashed potatoes. The room fell silent for a moment, not quite sure what was going on. Sabo, having seen this before, smiled at the opportunity to get his revenge. Nay, Aizu, would you happen to have anything I could draw with? Sabo asked the cross-dresser overly sweetly. Aizu raised a brow at the kid, but pulled out one of his liquid eyeliner pencils he was going to discard after dinner due to it drying up quickly. Passing the black makeup to Sabo, he watched as the kid walked over to Ace, lifted his head up and began to connect the freckles on his cheeks. Everyone couldn't stop themselves from laughing hysterically at the scene. "Does this happen often, Yoi?" Marco asked, trying and failing to suppress a grin. "Ace is narcoleptic, so yeah, this does happen pretty often," Sabo smiled, letting his brother sleep in his dinner with black makeup covering his cheeks. "I'd wake him up soon though," Thatch cautioned. Sabo tilted his head in confusion. "Luffy doesn't care what's in the way when food is involved. Ace won't get anything if he doesn't get up before Luffy's finished," he said with a shrug, making Sabo sigh before hitting Ace in the back of the head. Ace jumped up in surprise and looked around before picking up his fork and continuing eating. "Oh, I don't know if you've realized this yet, but Ace's appetite is probably just as big as Luffy's," Sabo said, smirking as Thatch paled. The little blonde couldn't help but smile as his revenge had been carried out on both Ace and Thatch. What a good day it had been. Luffy was sitting on the figurehead of the Moby staring at the water like usual. He enjoyed watching the ripples from the ship on the surface and the sound of the waves hitting the ship's side. Sometimes he just closed his eyes and listened for hours on end, enjoying the freedom of the water. The crew was heading back towards a winter island, making their way ever closer to Saboty. Pops had decided that the boys were now accustomed to the Grand Line's weather changes and Dr. Myra was watching over them to ensure no sickness happened, so it was back to the new world they were heading. The crew wasn't actually planning on stopping off at the winter island, but with some whining and complaining and begging to Marco, who in turn had to tell the navigation division the orders, the winter island was now part of the plan. Thatch smiled widely at the thought of spending Christmas in the snow. For Thatch, it wasn't the day or whatever meaning it came with that made him love the holiday, it was the meaning of family and being close together that made him smile. The nurses once told Luffy that Valentine's Day was to show your love for someone. Christmas was pretty much the same deal. This time was a chance to show his family how much he cared and appreciated them all for who they are. The crew as a whole was way too big to just get everyone a present, so they drew names from a hat and did their best to get that person a gift. Luffy had experienced Christmas many times before and loved the whole season, or maybe it was just the fact he got presents. Ace and Sabo, however, had never gone through this and had no clue as to why the ship was now being decorated and Luffy was wearing a red fuzzy hat on his head instead of his normal one. Ace, having lived with bandits his whole life, never celebrated anything other than eating a good meal and being happy for that. Dayton did throw him something different for his birthday every once in a while. Usually it was a new blanket or letting him have the first bite of dinner, but nothing too special. Luffy's name was never entered in the drawing since everyone wanted to buy him gifts. Seeing the kid happy made the crew smile, and now Ace and Sabo were part of the present exchanges whether they liked it or not. The crew had known Christmas was coming for quite some time, especially since the lively 4th Division began to spread their versions of Christmas cheer. Sabo had been to Christmas parties with his original noble family a few times before and absolutely hated them. He hated the stuffiness and the comparing of who got the most expensive present there. He wasn't looking forward to Christmas even though he was away from those people. The memory of it still left a bad taste to him. A few weeks before, Thatch was walking along the streets of an island and saw in the window a bright orange hat. It was just sitting there begging to be worn, but Thatch would never wear a hat that would conflict with his amazing hairstyle after all. He, however, could think of one little brat that was missing a hat, and that was sad in his eyes. Luffy wore his ever-loving straw hat and Sabo had his large top hat. Ace was the only brat without something covering his dark wavy hair. Thatch couldn't let that go for very long, so he bought the hat as a present for Christmas. Marco had been walking with Aizu and Vista, checking out shops around the town in hopes to find something for the brats. Marco was just about to give up and buy the kid some new clothes or something like that when Vista pointed out a small shop close by. The shop had plenty of smaller weapons in it, training weapons to teach a child, but still weapons all the same. Luffy had been training with the commanders to get better at protecting himself and work on his aiming, which he still rather sucked at. Vista pointed out some wooden swords that the kid would probably like. He knew Luffy was working with a metal pipe, but the swords could help teach him better balance. Aizu saw a slingshot that he believed he could use to help train the kid to have a better aim, and a grin began to form on the man's face at the thought of Luffy and him training more together. Marco saw something a little less important. In the back of the shop was a collection of bronze statues. Some of the statues were big and some were small, but they all had that old feel to them that he knew the kid would love. The men bought what they saw for the children in the shop and left with lighter hearts and an excitement for Christmas coming up. Along the way they had picked up things for Sabo and Ace as well as buying their chosen person their present for the year. All in all, it was a pretty productive day. Luffy, being the ever-hungry child he was sent as far away from the kitchen as possible while the cooks worked very hard on a feast for the special day. Because he wasn't allowed near the galley but could smell the delicious turkeys cooking everywhere on the ship, Luffy decided to go to his special spot on the figurehead to try and avoid the amazing smells. "What cha doin'?" Sabo said, climbing over the railing to sit with Luffy. Sabo wasn't sure the kid should be out here but figured if Marco hadn't stopped him he was relatively safe. Marco wouldn't let Luffy do anything dangerous while he was around. "Just watching," Luffy replied while laid on his stomach, his hands resting under his chin and his eyes turned up towards the ocean in front of him. Sabo sat down beside him and tried to see whatever Luffy was watching but found nothing. "All I see is the ocean," he trailed off, hoping Luffy would explain whatever he was looking at. "MN, isn't it amazing?" he said with his grin. Sabo shook his head and stuffed the straw hat onto Luffy's dark hair. "What's going on with the crew today?" he asked, finally not understanding the chaos that was happening around him. Luffy just smiled wider, sitting up. "It's Christmas Eve," Luffy said with a large cheer. "And so what?" Ace came climbing over the railing towards the kids, looking annoyed to find them somewhere he wasn't. "Christmas is amazing. Santa comes and gives presents." He threw his hands in the air in exaggeration. "Santa? Isn't Santa for kids?" Sabo asked Luffy with an incredulous look. "Santa is for everyone," Luffy said to him in return, giving Sabo a weird look. Ace just looked between the two, confused. "Who the heck is Santa?" he asked, making the kids laugh. "Santa is a mystery man who brings presents," Luffy explained seriously to Ace, who in turn looked towards Sabo for a better explanation, only for the kid to shrug his shoulders. "Pretty much," he said with a smile. "Well, why does he do that?" Ace, now more confused than before, asked them. Luffy laughed. "It's a mystery," and with that the kid got up and ran off somewhere else. Sabo had never really learned about Santa since his family just bought stuff and said it was from them. Either Santa didn't care for the nobles of the world, in which he didn't blame the guy, or he didn't exist. Ace, getting the hint that Luffy was off in search of either food or entertainment, left the figurehead in search of what the heck Santa was and why Luffy was excited to see him. Sabo sighed as he watched Ace wander off on his own and decided to go to the library to read up on things his own way. The three may be brothers now, but they were very different in many ways from one another. Ace wandered until he found Marco leaving Whitebeard's room with a satisfied smile on his face. "Yo," Ace said, waving towards the man who smiled at the kid. "Where's your brother's Yoi?" he asked, looking down at the child who usually went everywhere the other two went. Marco had just dropped off all of his finished paperwork to the old man and felt free now that he could spend Christmas without the knowledge he would be working the rest of the next day. "I think Luffy has gone off to beg at the kitchens and Sabo, well done. Oh, it's not like I have to be with them all the time," Ace said, crossing his arms and pouting a bit. Marco smiled wider at him. "And what about you, Yoi? Where are you heading?" he bent DTTER. "I'm looking into who this Santa guy is and why he brings stupid presents to Luffy. He sounds suspicious to me and Luffy's too innocent to know anything, so I have to protect him," Ace said, nodding his head and closing his eyes in determination to protect Luffy from this weirdo. Marco laughed, and loudly. This was the first time anyone had said that to him, especially a child. "Why don't I tell you a story about this Santa guy to clear things up? Sound good, brat Yoi?" Marco said, offering his hand out to Ace, who hesitantly took it and let Marco lead him to the library, where he found Sabo with a pile of books on one of the desks. "Now what are you doing, Yoi?" Marco asked, looking at the pile in confusion. "I'm trying to find out why Luffy likes Christmas so much. I mean, I've heard of it before, even had times where I participated in it, but not really sure why it's so important," he said with a shrug, putting another book down, sighing. Marco looked at the kids softly, now getting what was going on. Luffy had probably mentioned Christmas and Santa to the boys and they were interested. "Well, I can explain things, I guess." Marco started, waiting for Ace to pull up a chair beside Sabo to pay attention to Marco. "I'm not giving you a huge backstory. That's boring, and we're pirates, or at least I am, so I'll give you what I think Christmas time is about, Yoi," Marco said. The boys nodded their head in understanding. Ace wasn't interested in a long story since he was pretty sure a narcoleptic fit was on its way sometime soon. "Christmas is about family gathering and having a good time. Once a year we all gather together to appreciate that we are a family, and even though we argue, have fights and drive each other up the walls. We are still brothers and sisters under this flag," Marco said, giving the kids an understanding of his Christmas and how he felt on the subject. "Then what's with the presents? Is it someone's birthday?" Ace asked, confused now about that part. "No, it's not any of our family's birthday, it's just a thing that's done on this day. A man named Santa Claus comes and gives presents for children who have been good that year, and if you were bad all you'll get is a lump of coal yoy," he said, pointing his finger in the air as a warning to being bad. The look on the kids' faces almost made Marco laugh. They both looked terrified for some reason. We haven't been the best this year. What if Santa doesn't come at all?" Ace stammered out, his eyes wide in worry. "What can we do to make it up to Santa? We don't even know what he looks like," Sabo shouted in fear. Marco really had to hold back his laughter. "Well, Santa is a big fat man who wears red and comes to give presents while the children are sleeping, so don't worry about seeing him yoy. What can you do to get back on his good list?" "Well, I know," Marco said. The kids looked up at him, excited to do anything. "You can go and help out Thatch get the tables ready for the feast. That sounds like something Santa would be very happy to see you both do yoy." Marco felt proud of this scheme and getting the kids to do some extra little bit. "Right, we'll go and get Luffy to help out," they said, jumping up, but Marco stopped them quickly. "Luffy's been pretty good this year, so I think he's safe yoy. Why don't you let me handle him?" The boys looked at each other and nodded their heads in understanding before running off towards the kitchen to see what they can do to help get back on the good list. Marco chuckled quietly while walking towards the main deck to see Luffy now dressed in a reindeer onesie he guessed the nurses had forced him into. "You look rather cozy, kid," Marco said, kneeling down to look at Luffy fully. The onesie was exactly like a reindeer's body with brown fuzzy fabric, a small tail on the kid's behind and a hood with antlers over his head. Luffy smiled brightly at his big brother and nodded his head, actually liking his clothing but only wished it was red and not brown. Nurse Hannah told me it would keep me warm and she was right," he said while wrapping his arms around Marco's neck, allowing the man to pick the kid up. "Since you're dressed like a reindeer, would you like to hear a story about a magical one yoy?" he asked the kid and watched his eyes sparkle in wonder. Bringing Luffy over to a small part of the ship, they sat down Luffy on Marco's lap and he told Luffy all about Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer who helped save Christmas. By the end, Luffy was determined to make a reindeer his friend one day. Marco just wished him luck and laughed. Once dinner rolled around, Thatch had made the most delicious meal the two younger boys had ever had before. Luffy had experienced this type of Christmas many times in his short life, so he was used to this. Ace and Sabo not so much. Thatch thanked Marco for getting the brats to help him out without any problems and congratulated him on the fantastic idea of using Santa to his advantage. Once dinner finished, Marco made the kids take a warm bath and let them play around for a bit longer before bed. The three were chasing each other around on the deck when Luffy stopped running and looked up at the sky. Whitebeard was sitting on his throne watching his youngest sons play and smiled at the littlest one. "It's snowing," Luffy shouted as a snowflake landed on his nose and melted. The other kids stopped and looked on in wonder before Marco came out to check on them, seeing the snow. "All right brats, it's bedtime yoy." Pop stood up also, meaning that it really was time for bed. The boys groaned. "But we're not tired, Marco." Sabo whined. Ace and Luffy nodded their heads in agreement and Marco was about to reply, but Pops cut in. "If you don't go to sleep, Santa can't come," he stated, and all eyes widened at their father. They couldn't risk Santa missing them because they were awake, so they all said their good nights and headed off to their room for bed. "I wonder just how long we will be able to use that for," Thatch said from beside Marco, who shook his head. "This will probably be the only year for Sabo and Ace. They're too smart to continue to believe in Santa Claus. Luffy is another matter. For him, who knows?" Marco said, shaking his head at the kids. "Well, shall we get their presents ready for the morning?" Thatch asked, and all present nodded their heads, gathering up the brats' gifts. They would do a proper exchange in the morning for one another, but for the kids they wanted them to wake up and see all the gifts ready for them. When morning came, the kids burst from their room towards a commander who directed them towards Pop's chair, where presents all piled around it. Ace's eyes widened in excitement. Never had anyone ever given him a wrapped present before. Sabo was just in as much shock as Ace, looking at all the presents, and this time there wasn't anyone sticking their noses up or complaining. It was perfect. Luffy was impatient and jumped towards the pile, ready to open ones with his name on them. "Hold up, kid," Thatch said, grabbing Luffy around the middle before he could tear through everything. "Why don't we let your brothers open a present first?" he said, smiling down to Luffy, and was happy to get a nod in return. Luffy sat down in front of the presents while the two boys moved closer to see which ones were for them. The whole crew came to surround the kids, excited to see the unwrapping and the gifts that they would get. Ace pulled a large square present from the pile and opened it carefully not to damage the wrapping paper. Once he finished, he opened the lid on a box and found a bright orange cowboy hat with a chain of a sad face and a grinning face on it. Ace smiled widely towards the hat before putting it on his head in delight. "Wow, Ace! Santa brought you a hat," Luffy said excitedly. Ace blushed and nodded his head, happy to have a gift of his own. Thatch's grin couldn't have been wider. He was so happy the kid liked the hat and that he had stumbled upon that shop. Sabo opened his present, but unlike Ace, he rushed to get the paper off of the gift. When he opened it up, he saw a leather-bound BD ink beside it. Sabo smiled softly looking at the gift when Haruta sat down beside him. "It's a journal so you can keep track of your experiences, both good and bad, so no memory is left forgotten," she said, and Sabo nodded, loving his gift so much. Luffy knew that it was his turn, and he opened up a gift that was long and, like Sabo, wasted no time unwrapping the paper. When he opened the box, he saw a long wooden training sword and his eyes lit up in excitement. "Looks like Santa would like you to become the greatest swordsman around," Vista said, while Marco rolled his eyes like that would ever happen. Ace, realizing it was his turn again, opened up another present to find clothing, and he was grateful. He didn't really have much good clothing, so anything was wonderful to him. Sabo opened up to find maps and books about navigation and how to learn it. Luffy opened his presents to find the slingshot, making Aizu counter Vista's words with how Luffy would become the true king of snipers in this world. Marco just shook his head at the two. The boys continued to open presents, getting a lot of gifts from Santa, and Luffy loved his bronze statue of a knight. He swore to treasure it, always making Marco smile widely, knowing that Luffy would love that. Once they had all finished unwrapping their gifts and showing them off, Marco and Thatch helped the kids put their gifts away and turned them towards the galley for brunch. Whitebeard smiled at his youngest children, happy to see them so happy. He knew from their looks that the elder boys may not have ever experienced this before, and hoped there would be more things in this coming new year for them to learn and grow from. After all, they were his children now and forever. This Christmas may have been a bit more lively for them all, but all in all it was the best one around in Marco's eyes, since he got to see Luffy smile and Ace and Sabo experience what being a part of a family was supposed to feel like. Everyone was happy and the crew never looked brighter. Ace knew it was coming, the day he hated most in this world. Right after Christmas, there was now a bright feeling in his heart that he had never truly felt before. He was so into that new feeling he forgot the day that comes quickly after it, his birthday. New Year's Day was a day when everyone celebrated the beginning of a new year, but for him it was a reminder that he was even allowed to be born into this world, and he hated it. Unfortunately for Ace, Sabo mentioned this little fact to the loud and excitable Luffy, and Luffy mentioned it to every passing person on the large ship. The one day he would like to forever forget was now about to be celebrated, and he could do nothing to stop it. "So I hear it's your birthday soon?" Thatch said, leaning against a wall while Ace just closed his eyes and tried to keep calm. "And what of it? It's just another year, no big deal," he snarled to the man who looked shocked at this. "Ace, this is a huge deal. You're turning 11 years old, soon you'll be a teenager. We need to celebrate your youth while we have the chance," Thatch said, dramatically ignoring the kid's tone of voice for now. Ace rolled his eyes at the man in annoyance. "Really, it's not a big deal. I'd rather no one actually remembered my birthday and just had a normal day," he said, shrugging his shoulders and walking away. Thatch wasn't going to allow this to go on, a kid not wanting to celebrate his own birthday. What was wrong with that child? Thatch knew he would have to make it the best birthday yet. Before Thatch could actually know how to celebrate the brat's birthday, he would have to do some digging for information. Just why did the kid hate his birthday so much? Luffy loves his birthday, heck, even he loved his birthday, but will refuse to tell you his age. He knew that Luffy had no other information or he would have already given it up. But Sabo, he just might be what Thatch was looking for. Unfortunately for Thatch, Sabo seemed to realize that the crew might want information and made himself as hard to catch as possible, even using Luffy to escape from the many siblings on the ship. Thatch had been chasing the kid around for about a day when he finally cornered him. "You can't outrun me forever, kid. I just want to talk," he said, putting his hands up as a surrendering, peacemaking friendly way in hopes the kid wouldn't pull some sort of ninja stuff and disappear. "I'll never say anything," Sabo said defiantly, making Thatch inwardly groan. "I just want to know why Ace hates his birthday. It's not like I'm asking you to spill his life story." But Sabo refused to let up. If he has a reason, then it's his reason to tell. He glared at the commander. Sabo knew Ace's reason, even Luffy sort of knew Ace's reason, but it was Ace's job to tell others, not his or Luffy's. "We just want to do a small celebration, nothing big. I just want to know why he won't even let us do that," Thatch said softly, and Sabo did feel bad about not telling them, but still. "I'm sorry, but it's not my place to tell you," Sabo sighed, looking down, now feeling guilty. "If I asked Ace, would he tell me the reason?" Thatch questioned the kid, who shook his head. "Most likely not. He hates his birthday almost as much as his—" Sabo's eyes widened and he placed his hands over his mouth and looked up at Thatch, shocked. Thatch raised his brow at the kid, hoping to get him to go on, but Sabo took a step back and bolted away quickly. "Well, that was interesting, almost as much as what dare I ask." He was happy to have gotten a clue, even if it was unintended. Later that day, Thatch caught up to Luffy, who looked up at him with bright sparkling eyes. "So are we gonna have a party for Ace?" Luffy asked excitedly. "I don't think so, kid. Ace doesn't want us to," Thatch said with disappointment, and Luffy looked devastated. "But it's his birthday. Birthdays are fun," Luffy pleaded to the man who understood the wonderful thing called birthdays. "Ace doesn't seem to like his birthday, so it might be a good idea not to do anything, Lou." Luffy's eyes widened and a spark of understanding shot through those dark brown eyes. "Maybe it's because of—" and Luffy let go of Thatch's hand and took off again, making the brunette very curious as to what was going on that he didn't know about. Luffy found Sabo and Ace in their room playing a game of cards just as he burst through the door. "Do you not like your birthday because of your dad?" Luffy blurted out, making Sabo's mouth drop and Ace scowl. "And what do you know of anything?" Ace stood up and pounded the kid on the top of his head, making a bump grow. "Because I know you don't like him, but that doesn't mean you don't need to like your birthday," Luffy exclaimed while nursing the bump growing as Ace pounded him once more, causing another to grow on top. "It doesn't matter," he shouted and stomped out of the room. Sabo sighed and looked at the kid, who now had a tear in his eye and his hand on his sore head. "You know just what to say to piss people off, you know that, right?" Sabo sighed a little more and knelt down to the kid, who had now turned his head to the side in confusion. "What do ya mean?" he whined, and Sabo patted his back a bit before helping him back on his feet. "Let's go talk with Ace, K?" Sabo smiled and took Luffy's hand, hoping to find the hot head before any more trouble could be done. The boys hand in hand wandered the ship looking for Ace, while Thatch retreated to the kitchen, deciding to work on lunch rather than mope about not being able to celebrate a birthday. It was during this time that Ace walked into the kitchen and pulled a stool up towards the counter to sit on. Thatch watched the kid from the corner of his eyes, curious as to why the kid decided to come visit him after all the questioning he had done. "Nay," he said. Thatch put down the knife he was using to pay attention to the kid, giving him permission to continue on. "Do you think it was good that I was born?" Ace asked quietly, looking at the floor away from Thatch, who frowned at the question. "No, I don't," he said softly. Ace closed his eyes in acceptance. "I think it was better than good. I think it is the most wonderful thing." Ace looked up at the man quickly. "But you just said—" He was cut off by a hand on his shoulder. Thatch smiled kindly at the kid. "You're here and that makes me and so many people happy. By you being born, Luffy and Sabo have a friend to play with, fight with and love dearly. By you being here, I have a little brother now to take care of and teach until he's grown. By you being here, Luffy was able to meet Sabo and he was able to meet you. I don't think it was good that you were born. I think it was essential that you were born, Ace. You bring a new type of happiness to this ship, to this family, and I can't even remember what it was like before you and Sabo, Ace," Thatch said to the kid, whose eyes had widened and were starting to sting with emotions he refused to show. Is that why you want to celebrate my birthday?" he said softly, his voice shaky and his throat tight. "I like to remind everyone on this ship that this is one more year they have lived being a family. You're a part of the family now, Ace. Each year I want to now remind you that you're very loved by us, that's all," he said, and Ace bit his lip, really fighting hard now. "It's all right, kid, we don't need to celebrate, just know that we do care for you," he said softly, pulling Ace in for one of his big hugs, and Ace responded, for the first time ever taking deep breaths to calm himself down. He pulled away and looked at Thatch. "Maybe we can do something super small," he said, and Thatch smiled a bit wider. Just with us, and Ace nodded. Thatch knew that it was a start, that Ace was opening his heart up to him but wasn't completely ready to open to the whole crew yet. Just you, Luffy, Sabo and I, Ace nodded again. Alright. We'll celebrate tonight in my room after dinner, sound okay? Ace looked confused. But my birthday isn't for another 3 days, he said, but Thatch shook his head. You don't like that day, right? Until the day you do celebrate on a different day. Thatch crossed his arms and nodded, satisfied at his logic, making Ace laugh at him. Alright, sounds fair, he said before waving at his friend and running off to relay the information to Luffy and Sabo. Looks like I have a cake to make tonight, he said with a smile, hoping Ace liked chocolate. After dinner, Sabo, Luffy and Ace all excused themselves from a very curious Marco and followed Thatch to his room, where he had set up the chocolate strawberry cake for Ace and a few board games on the desk. Ace saw the cake and he froze. He had never had a cake before. Look, Ace, a cake. Luffy went running right away towards it, but Thatch caught him and shook his head. It's Ace's birthday, he gets the first slice and there's plenty for everyone, he said, and Luffy turned towards Ace, who was still shell-shocked, and he shook his head at the kid. Luffy, may be patient because it's your birthday, but even he won't last long, so come get a slice, brat, he said to Ace, who took a step forward slowly towards the cake. Once everyone had a slice, they decided what game they wanted to play first and got down to it. Luffy always seemed to end up with way more cards by the end of those games than when he started, which made everyone laugh. It wasn't a big celebration like Thatch was used to, but this time he spent with the brats around him was valuable and would be treasured always. Ace, for the first time in his life, loved his birthday and had a new discovery for his love of chocolate cake. It was also a rare time for him to laugh so much, and with a wide smile he couldn't wait until next year when they would do this all over again. Shanks is coming. Shanks is coming. Shanks is coming. Luffy shouted while running around the Moby in pure happiness. Marco felt a headache coming on but smiled anyways for the kid. Yes, I'm afraid he is Yui. He sighed while Luffy cheered some more at this information. Who's Shanks? Ace asked Marco, who looked down at the kid, a shadow covering his face. The most annoying man you will ever meet in your life, he said seriously. Ace took a step back and gave Marco a weird look. How so? Sabo asked from beside Ace, looking at Marco weirdly. Just picture a grown, drunk Luffy with red hair and you have the man known as Shanks Yui. He sighed while Ace and Sabo's eyes widened in horror. Then why is he coming here? Sabo exclaimed, not that excited to see that version on his little brother. Because he is one of the 4 emperors, just like Pops. He's also Luffy's idol, unfortunately, Thatch said, joining the conversation, and Marco sighed once again. Of all the people Luffy could look up to, Shanks would be it. Seriously, why didn't he ever look up to me that way? I've known him longer, Yui. Marco said, annoyed at the man already. Thatch laughed and patted Marco on the shoulder. You're his brother, and Shanks is someone outside of the family, someone he can watch from a distance. He does look up to you, Marco, he just does it in a different way, that's all. Marco gave Thatch a grateful smile while the 2 boys looked confused at the grown men. How long till he gets here then? Sabo asked, still afraid of the description of the man but excited to meet another that had the same title as his pops. Soon enough, Yui, Marco said before he headed off to chase after the hyper child. Luffy was excited. He hadn't seen Shanks in almost 2 years. He couldn't wait to show him how much he had grown since he first got his hat. He had worked really hard on controlling his Gomu powers, but his aim was still a struggle for him. He really was trying, it was just so hard. He was taught to imagine the exact spot he wanted to hit, and he did, but he always missed it a little bit. He wanted to be stronger first, then aim, but Aizu kept scolding him, saying strength was nothing if he couldn't hit his target. He didn't understand, so he just did what he always did and hoped for the best. Nay Luffy, what's Shanks really like? Ace asked Luffy, who brightened at the thought of the man. He's so cool, he's super strong and can do anything. He likes to party a lot, and I got my Gomu no Mi from him. Luffy's grin was almost splitting his face. He's really strong? Sabo asked him, and Luffy nodded his head quickly. MN, Thatch said that he was as strong as Pops. He shouted, and Sabo covered his ears quickly from the noise. Calm down Luffy, you're hurting my ears, he exclaimed at the kid in annoyance, who only laughed. She sorry. He smiled, not sounding sorry at all, before running off to see the old man. "Pops, when is Shanks coming?" he shouted up at the old man who just laughed at the kid knowing he would be this excited. "Soon enough, my son, we are planning on meeting on the closest island." He smiled down at the kid who was now climbing his leg to sit on his lap. "He's not coming here." Luffy began to pout. "No, it's safer to meet at an island under my protection. Think of it this way, little one, you get to have an adventure and see Shanks all in the same day." He knew that would catch the kid's attention. Adventure and Shanks, he trailed off, his eyes shining brightly at the thought only a plateful of meat could make this any better. "How much longer?" he asked his father, and Luffy's eyes were wide and bright, making the old man's heart swell for the boy. "We will be there in an hour. If you go to the figurehead you can see the island from here." He pointed his large hand in the distance they were traveling. Luffy jumped off his lap and waved goodbye before rushing to see the island from the spot. Lying on his stomach, Luffy stared at the approaching island, a wide grin on his face and his hands tugging on the sides of the hat in anticipation. "Shanks," he said to himself, closing his eyes, remembering the time he spent with the man. Marco was watching from his spot above at the kid, a twinge of jealousy at the rival emperor for having hold of the kid's heart like this. He couldn't help, however, to smile softly at the way Luffy was acting. He knew Luffy loved them all, but Shanks was on a level higher than them, lower than Pops, but more than Marco and Thatch. He shook his head to clear out the dark thoughts of being less loved than red-haired Shanks and tried to feel the excitement the kid was letting off. Everything was going to be alright and Luffy would have some fun. When they were close enough to the island, Luffy spotted the red force anchored at the docks and practically vibrated at the thought of seeing Shanks again. Ace and Sabo were a little shaken around how Luffy was reacting to the man, so they watched him closely. When the large ship anchored at the docks, many people were there to greet the crew, but Luffy went running straight off and towards a man with bright red hair, jumping in the air and hugging the man around the middle. "Luffy," he laughed out loudly, making Luffy just hug him tighter. "Shanks, I missed you," he said, putting his face into the man's shirt, hiding the tears of happiness he felt coming. "I missed you too, kid. You're taking care of my hat, right?" he said, patting the kid on the head, the straw hat dangling around his neck. "MN," he said, letting Shanks go and pulling the hat onto his head tightly. "I can't give it back to you yet though," he said seriously, making Shanks laugh once again. "Dahahaha. Of course you can't. You're not a pirate yet. Dahahaha." Luffy felt his eye twitching. "I so am a pirate. I'm just a mini one." Luffy stomped his foot onto Shanks's foot in annoyance, and the man grabbed his foot in pain. "A brat is still a brat," he said, nursing his sore foot now, and smiled when he saw Marco standing behind Luffy, his hand on his hip and a look of annoyance on his lazy face. "Marco, it's been a while, do you want?" He was cut off rather sharply by Marco, who glared at the emperor. "Never yoi," he said, and Shanks laughed. "Just checking, Luffy, how about we go get some lunch? It's been a long time, I bet you have some good stories to tell me." Luffy nodded his head and took Shanks's hand, letting the man lead him away from the crew. He waved goodbye to Marco quickly, then disappeared into the crowd of people with Shanks. "Do you want us to follow them, Marco?" Ace asked the blonde, never taking his eyes off of the way Luffy went. "Nah, let them be. Shanks is a weird man, but he does care about Luffy. He'll protect him from anything and everything," he said, his own eyes watching the direction they went to, memorizing it just in case something happened. "If you say so," Ace said, but shrugged his shoulders in acceptance. "So that's the man Luffy looks up to?" Sabo said, while thinking the description of the man was spot on, a drunken older Luffy with red hair. "Yeah, Luffy got his hat from Shanks and made a promise with him to become a strong pirate someday, yoi," Marco said, leading the kids towards the town to walk around with them. "Is that why he wants to be the Pirate King?" Ace said, looking at the ground as he said those words. "Probably that's a part of the reason, but not all of it." Pops told Luffy old tales of the Pirate King and Luffy really liked them. When the dream started, I'm not sure, but it's not like we've really done anything to stop this dream. If anything, I don't really mind having Luffy become the king. If he can prove he's strong enough for the title, then it would make me proud to call the next king my brother yoi," Marco said with a thoughtful smile on his face, while Ace just stared at the man, really taking in his words. Luffy had a big dream, one that other pirates have and one that other pirates have given up on. Ace wasn't sure what his dream was. He knew he wanted his name to be known, but how? Where did he need to start for that? Was that really TA wish? Ace was so caught up in his own mind he walked into a stranger by accident. "Watch where you're going, you stupid brat. A man who looked and smelled like a bandit sneered at Ace, making Marco stop in his tracks to glare at the man. "I could say the same to you, Yui," he said back to the bandit calmly, but all could hear the ice in his voice warning the stranger that fighting Marco was out of the question. The bandit sneered once more and walked off, complaining of needing a drink to drown them out. "I smelled trouble," Sabo said from beside Marco, who was helping Ace back on his feet when the brunette wrinkled his nose in response. "You sure trouble is what you smell?" "I smell bandit, and man, does he need a shower?" Ace replied, waving his hand over his nose, making Sabo laugh and Marco smile. "Common brats, let's keep moving," and they headed off into town. Line break. "So Ace and Sabo, they didn't really like me at first, but we're cool now. I got beaten up really bad though before we became friends, that hurt a lot. The guy had a spiked glove and he kept hitting me. I was sorta scared, then Marco and Thatch came in all cool like and fought off the bad guys. I was tired though, I mean I was hit really hard a lot. I wasn't scared that badly. I knew they would come for me," Luffy said to Shanks, who listened to the kid at the bar table. He took in the kid's words and felt concern at the thought of him being hurt. "Those kids just left you there? Why did you want to be their friend anyways, Lou? I mean, they abandoned you with someone you didn't know. You could have been killed," Shanks said, worry in his voice. "I wouldn't have minded." This caught Shanks's attention. "Being alone hurts. It hurts so much that I'd rather die than feel that pain." Luffy had stopped eating his meat and Shanks watched him closely. "You're never alone, kid," he said seriously. "I know, but not everyone has time to be with me. They all have bigger things to do and I'm still small, there was no one to play with," he said, his meat now completely ignored. "Be you your friends now, right?" he said, trying to get the kid away from the sadness, and it worked when Luffy brightened. "More than that. We're brothers, and if anyone ever tries to hurt them, I'll beat them up." Shanks smiled at those words. He'd have to meet the two brats and make sure they understood Luffy was to be protected by them at all times. "Oh, will you?" he laughed out, making Luffy scowl and stand up on his bar stool. "Of course. My punch is as strong a pistol." And he mock-punched the air to emphasize his point, but Shanks took a bite of his food and smiled again. "A pistol? Right, sure," he said off-handedly, causing Luffy's brow to twitch in annoyance. "What's that supposed to mean?" he shouted at the man. Shanks was about to mention something unimportant when the door to the bar opened suddenly with a bang on the wall, making Luffy turn his head to stare at the person who made the noise. Shanks's crew and Ben all stopped talking and watched the man curiously as he and a group of people came strolling into the room. "Serve me and my men up the best sake in this joint," he said, and Shanks, who was sitting beside Luffy, became protective of the kid and turned his back towards Luffy, putting the kid behind him ever so slightly on the bar stool. Marco would never forgive him if Luffy was hurt in his presence. "I'm sorry, sir. We've just run out of sake," the waitress said nervously, and the man raised his eyebrow. "Then just what are these stupid pirates drinking? Water?" he asked, waving his hand towards the crew who were ready in case of anything but didn't move at all. "They're drinking sake, but they just finished the very last of it," she said, trying to keep calm. Shanks waved his hand in the air, signaling the man over. "Here, my men drank a lot, but I do have this once bottle left over, why don't you have it?" he said in good nature that the man didn't seem to appreciate. He looked right at Shanks before lifting his hand up and shattering the bottle, sending the sake and glass everywhere. Luffy pushed himself back in surprise at the sudden amount of liquid spilling everywhere, and the waitress covered her mouth in shock. "I'm a bandit worth 8 million berry, one bottle of sake isn't going to be enough," he said while sake dripped off of Shanks's red hair. When Shanks looked up, he had a look of worry on his face. "Ah, now the floor's all wet. Sorry about that, Ms. Waitress, do you have a mop?" And Shanks got on the ground and stated to clean up the mess that was made. She came out of her shock and began to run and help Shanks clear up the mess in a panic. The bandit pulled out his sword, still glaring at Shanks, and sliced it along the bar counter, shattering everything, spilling drink everywhere. Luffy was shocked into silence and couldn't move. "If there's no sake here, then I'm wasting my time. Later, idiot pirates." And with that, the bandits left, howling in laughter at the mess they had created. Luffy was now shaking, holding onto his glass. He had never been so angry before. How dare they do that to Shanks? Shanks was on the floor covered in sake and a blank expression on his face. The waitress came over to help him, asking if he was okay. "Oh, I'm alright, there's no problem," he said before looking up and laughing loudly, and the crew laughed just as loud. "He really got you, Captain," Usopp shouted, tears in his eyes from laughing so hard. "How shameful." Another shouted laughing and Shanks laughed loudly. Among them the only one not laughing was Luffy. "Why are you laughing?" he shouted at the crew, who all stopped to look at him in shock. Shanks said to the kid, who jumped to the ground and balled his hands into fist and shouted right at Shanks. "That was embarrassing. Why didn't you fight back? So what if you were outnumbered? You should have fought like a real man. Aren't you supposed to be a pirate?" she shouted very quickly at Shanks, stomping his foot. Shanks brushed his hand through his hair and smiled softly at the kid. "I understand how you feel, but it's just spilled sake, nothing to get crazy about," he said, and gave a small grin at Luffy, who just made a face and began to walk away. "Screw that, I'm not going to be a weakling. I'm going to find Marco." Shanks sighed and shook his head at the kid, but let him go. Luffy would find Marco, and hopefully the pineapple head guy would explain it better to then kid. Luffy walked around town huffing out in anger. How dare they do that to Shanks, and how dare Shanks not fight back? Marco and Thatch would have fought back. He didn't know Shanks was that weak. He was wandering around when he saw the same bandit sitting outside laughing and talking loudly about how they beat up and humiliated a bunch of weak pirates. "Did you see their faces? Such weaklings. Cowards, the lot of them," another said, and hit his knee in laughter. "I should have just killed them all right there and then," the leader said cockily to his group, and Luffy had about enough of them. If Shanks wouldn't stand up to them, he sure as hell would. "Shut up, you big buffoon," Luffy shouted at the bandits, who all stopped what they were doing and stared at the kid. "Hey, wasn't he with those coward pirates?" one of them asked suddenly, and the leader raised his eyebrow in interest. "I said stop making fun of Shanks," and Luffy ran at the man, trying to punch him, only to be knocked down by the bandit. "And what if I don't feel like it?" he said with a slimy smile. "Then I'll kick your ass," Luffy shouted, and the bandits laughed. "Such a foul-mouthed little boy, why don't I teach you a lesson?" and he punched Luffy in the stomach, making him land on the ground hard. One of the villagers knew that Luffy was a part of the Whitebeard crew and wanted to end this trouble without getting the captain involved, so the villager ran as fast as she could to the mayor, explaining what she had seen, and they moved quickly to defuse the situation before the pirate crew could cause trouble. By the time the mayor got there, the bandit was holding Luffy up by his cheek, looked as it stretched out in his hands before he smiled. "Your body sure is interesting," he said with a laugh, looking Luffy over in interest. Shanks had cleaned himself up and was walking through town, hoping to find Luffy and have a good talk, when he ran into Marco, Thatch, and the two other kids, who all looked shocked not to see Luffy with any of them. "Where's Luffy Yoi?" Marco said, his voice tight with a worry now there. "We had a fight, I guess you can say. He told me he was going to find you," Shanks said, rubbing his head and smiling slightly. Marco sighed loudly. "And why did you fight?" Thatch said that was very unusual for Luffy to act like that. "Well, you see, he started, but then heard a bunch of commotion coming from a street over. Ben, who was behind Shanks, raised his brow, and the few members of Shanks' crew looked on in curiosity. "Shall we go see what's going on?" he said with a smile, and they all headed towards the noise, only to see Luffy being pushed around by a bandit. Blue flames started to lick Marco's shoulders, and his eyes narrowed. Thatch's hand moved towards his sword, but Shanks kept a calm face. "Stay here," he said, and started to walk forward. "It looks like punches and kicks don't do any damage to you," the bandit said, very interested in the kid now. "Damn it, say you're sorry," Luffy shouted, trying to punch the bandit. Ace and Sabo were glaring at the man, holding Luffy in the air, ready to jump in at any given second. "A rubber person, huh? I never imagined such a strange creature could exist," he said, looking at Luffy, who swore at the bandit and tried to punch him some more. The bandit swung his arm, and Luffy went flying into the ground and bounced a bit before stopping. "Shit. I won't ever forgive you," Luffy shouted at the man, and Ace and Sabo nodded their heads in agreement. They would never forgive this man. "A rubber person, huh? I bet I could make a lot of money if I sold him at Sabodi." He placed his hand under his chin and thought Marco had enough. His flames were now starting to flare. How dare this man talk of selling his little brother, his little Luffy? Marco was going to kill the man for those words, but Ben held onto his shoulder. "Leave it to Shanks," he said sternly, and Marco glared at the vice captain. Luffy had grabbed a stick from the ground and began to run at the man, hoping to hit him, only to be kicked in the head by the bandit and knocked down. "Please, can I go kick his ass?" Ace said, never taking his eyes off of Luffy. He was gritting his teeth so hard his jaw is hurting. "Leave this to Shanks," once again Ben said to the group. The bandit was now standing with his foot on Luffy's head and he was smiling down at the kid. "All I wanted was to have a nice drink. Did I say something you didn't like?" he asked Luffy, who was struggling to get back up. "Yes, you did apologize." The bandit sneered at Luffy and pulled out his sword. "Fine, I've decided I'm not going to sell you, I'm going to kill you instead right here and now." And he placed the sword at Luffy's throat. Marco had enough. Screw what Ben had said, he was stepping in. He took a step forward when Shanks caught Luffy's attention. Shanks walked up to the bandit, a smile on his face and his eyes overshadowed from the bright sun. "I was wondering where you had gone to, Luffy. Didn't you say you were looking for Marco?" he said, suddenly stopping in front of the bandit. Ben and the group walked past Marco, Thatch and the kids to stand behind Shanks supporting him. "If it isn't the bandits from earlier, Luffy, didn't you say that your punch was as strong as a pistol?" Shanks asked the kid, never taking his eyes off of the bandit. Luffy glared at Shanks, annoyed he would remind him of that. "You shut up," he said from under the bandit's foot. "Pirate, you're still here? Are you done cleaning already?" he asked Shanks with a grin, while Marco and Thatch were confused now on the situation. "Shanks clean? Please, like that will ever happen." Shanks took steps forward, still glaring at the bandit, who seemed to not realize he was in danger. "I don't know why you're here, but I suggest you run away before you get hurt. If you come any closer, you're a dead man, coward," he said, pointing his sword at Shanks now, who just ignored him and continued to walk forward. Another bandit stepped into Shanks's path and snarled at him. "Didn't you hear what he said?" He cocked his gun and pointed it at Shanks's head. "Don't take another step or I'll blow your brains out," he said, and Shanks stopped walking. "Now that you've drawn your pistol, I assume you're ready to put your life on the line," Shanks said, suddenly taking his eyes off the leader and looking at the bandit beside him. "Huh? What are you talking about?" he said, confused. "I'm saying that a pistol isn't for threats, it's for action." Shanks smiled at the bandit, who looked very confused now as Lucky snuck up and shot the bandit in the head, making the kid's eyes widen in surprise. Luffy had seen people get shot before, but not that close up. Aizu always made sure Luffy was at a safe distance whenever there was a fight, and Pops was always there to protect him. The bandits looked at the dead man in surprise, then looked up at the pirates while Lucky took a bite of his meat. "You killed him, how could you do that, you cowards?" one of them said suddenly in shock. "Cowards? Don't be naive. Do you think you're dealing with saints?" Ben said, glaring at the bandits. "The people in front of you are pirates. Listen, bandits, you can throw food and drink on my head and I'll laugh that off, but if you for whatever reason hurt one of my friends, I'll never forgive you." Shanks now glared fully at the bandit, who just began to laugh, not realizing anything. Thatch sighed, putting his sword away. "Idiots, I hope Shanks gives it to them," Thatch said. Marco also sighed and relaxed. When Shanks got like this, the bandits stood no chance. "We're not going to fight?" Sabo asked the men in confusion. "Shanks is an emperor just as much as Pops is. If they wanted to fight Shanks, they would need to call out Garp for the task, Yoi," Marco said, rolling his eyes. "Will not forgive, you said?" the leader said, cocking his head at Shanks. "Pirates who float around on the sea challenging bandits. What a joke," and pointed at Shanks. "Kill them all, men," he shouted to his group. Shanks was about to take a step forwards, but Ben moved faster. "I'll take care of them, I'm more than enough," he said, pulling his rifle out of his sash and staring at the bandits. He pulled his cigarette out of his mouth and burned the forehead of the first bandit to come his way and began to use the back of his rifle to hit the bandits down. Once all were brutally beaten to the ground, Ben lit up another smoke while everyone watched in shock. He pointed his rifle at the leader, who had his mouth hanging open, staring at his fallen men around him. "Don't flatter yourself, bandit," Ben said with a grin. "If you want to fight us, you should bring a battleship with you next time," he said, and Thatch laughed. "See, I told you they'd need the big guns to take on Shanks, Yoi," Marco said offhandedly. Luffy stared wide-eyed at Shanks and Ben while the bandit looked around, now feeling afraid. "So cool," Luffy said out loud, and Shanks had to fight a smile from forming on his face. "Wait, the kid provoked us," he said to Shanks, who stared at the bandit leader. "Whatever, aren't you a wanted man?" Shanks asked with a small smile. Marco sighed. This battle was over. He went to take a step forward when the bandit threw something at the ground and smoke appeared. When it faded away, Luffy and the bandit were gone. Marco's eyes widened as he sprinted towards Shanks, who looked equally as shocked at the sudden change in situation. "Spread out, men. Find the kid," he ordered to his crew, and Marco said the same to Thatch. Find Luffy at all costs, Ace. Sabo go find Pops. I'll look from above, and he jumped forwards turning into the phoenix that he was, and the groups wasted no time taking action. Ace and Sabo ran as fast as they could back to a few commanders were talking to one another, and Pops was listening from his chair. Pops! The boys shouted and everyone froze. Luffy has been taken by a bandit. The old man's eyes narrowed and he stood up from his chair. Then we'll just have to get him back. Everyone, your brother is missing, spread out and search for him. Bring the bandit back to me, he said, and a yell was given as everyone left the ship in search of their little brother. Shanks was panicking. This was his entire fault. He should have killed the bandit as soon as he hurt Luffy, but he wanted to give the kid a show. A reminder as to why he was the strongest one around. He wanted to look good for Luffy, and look where it got him. He ran by the docks away from their large ships when he saw Luffy in a small boat out away from the shore. Luffy, he said. Why hadn't Marco come out this way yet? He didn't even stop and think. He just jumped right into the water as Luffy was thrown overboard. Shanks picked up speed as he saw Luffy trying his very best to stay above, but his devil fruit abilities were about to bring him under. Someone, anyone, help me! Luffy shouted as loud as he could despite his situation, and Shanks looked up suddenly to see a large sea king staring at the bandit before eating him whole and crushing the ship. He would have laughed at the irony, as a bandit should never have taken to sea without knowing the dangers, but he saw the monster turn its eyes onto Luffy and dive back under to take another attack. Like hell was he going to allow this creature to kill the kid? Luffy was too important to wait too many people to die like this. Luffy's death would kill Marco and hurt the family in a way Shanks refused to imagine. He grabbed Luffy as suddenly as the Sea King returned and snapped his jaws around Shanks's arm, tearing it off. He would have cried out, but Luffy's wide eyes of fear kept his mouth shut and his eyes closed. Shanks was pissed now, pissed at the bandit for causing this, pissed at the Sea King for eating his arm. Shanks was full out pissed. He turned his eyes towards the creature and let it know just how mad he was. Get lost! And he released a wave of haki, scaring the crap out of the monster, sending it as far away as possible. Shanks wasn't sure how long they stood there. He was bleeding into the water, turning it red around them. Hey, how long are you going to keep crying? You're a man, aren't you? He asked, but felt like crying himself. Be you, but Shanks. Your arm, Luffy cried out, holding onto his shirt, tears pouring down his face. What this? It's just an arm. I'm just glad you're safe, Luffy. And he used his other arm to pull the kid closer to him, hugging him tightly as his crying got louder and louder. When they made it back to land, Thatch was there, his eyes wide at the blood covering both Luffy and Shanks. They grew even wider when they saw Shanks's arm, or lack of. Shanks took a step forward and stumbled. Thatch caught him and helped him down. Luffy was crying loudly, silently blaming himself. Luffy, a real man doesn't cry that much, Shanks said weakly, leaning against a wall, and Thatch called Marco over using his transponder snail. Marco in turn let everyone know they were safe and all rushed towards them. You need to get your arm looked at, Shanks, Ben said, kneeling down to his level, and Shanks smiled softly. Of course I do, Ben. He let everyone help him up and take him back to the Red Force to rest. Luffy cried a lot more into Marco's shirt. Shish, it's alright, Yui, he said, and carried the kid back towards the ship. Pops was standing there looking at them, worry evident on his face. Marco passed the crying child over to him, where he returned to hugging Luffy. You're safe, my son, nothing can hurt you now, he said, but Luffy just continued to cry until he fell asleep. Thatch looked up at the kid, knowing the pain he must be feeling. The bandit's dead, eaten by a Sea King, he reported to his father, who shook his head. Took the easy way out, he said, annoyed he didn't get the chance to punish a man for hurting his son. The thing ate off Shanks's arm. I think those are tears of fear rather than sadness, he reported, and the older man nodded his head. He may have nightmares, Yui, Marco said. Ace and Sabo stood back and watched the scene, but stepped forward finally. Then we'll protect him. If nightmares are on their way, then we'll fight them off, Sabo said, pointing a thumb at himself, and grinned widely at the men. As long as we're his brothers, nothing will ever touch him again, not even nightmares, Ace said, crossing his arms and glaring slightly, daring anyone to challenge his statement. We'll be counting on you, Haruta said, coming up behind Ace and kissing his cheek. Ace blushed in surprise and tried to wipe it off. Sabo laughed at him until he got his own kiss, reacting the exact same way as Ace. The next morning Luffy woke up in Marco's bed. He wasn't too sure when he fell asleep, but he knew he was hungry. He got up excited about food when the memories of yesterday crept in and his stomach dropped. "Shanks," he whispered, and Marco opened the door looking at him and smiling. "I was wondering when you were going to get up. Food's ready, Yui," he said, but Luffy looked away. "Not hungry anymore," he said, and Marco sat down on the bed looking at him. "Shanks is alright, Yui," he said, making Luffy look up. "He is." Marco nodded his head. "It's going to take a bit more than a seeking to take out that guy. Come on, let's go eat and we'll go check up on him. Sound good, Yui?" Luffy nodded his head and took Marco's hand and walked towards breakfast. After breakfast they did go see Shanks. Marco took Luffy to the Red Force but chose to wait outside and let them talk. Shanks?" Luffy said as he opened the door to Shanks's room. "Come in, kid," he said, and Luffy ran to the bed where he was resting. "I'm sorry," he shouted and hugged Shanks tightly. "There's nothing to apologize for, Lou. I do what I did again in a heartbeat. You're too important to me," he said softly and allowed the kid to cuddle into his side, resting his head on Shanks' chest. "Did it hurt?" he whispered, and Shanks looked at the ceiling. "Of course it did, but losing you would hurt a whole lot more." Luffy felt tears building in his eyes and blinked, trying to stop them. "You're the coolest ever, Shanks," he said, making the man laugh loudly. "Don't you ever forget it, kid." Luffy laughed softly along with him. He was still sad about Shanks's arm, but he was happy to have his hero still alive. "Line break, you're leaving now," he said as Shanks walked into his ship, a new cape covering the missing arm, his red hair blowing in the wind. "Yup, looks like you guys will be as well," he said. Luffy pulled the straw hat onto his head and tried to give his smile to the man. "I'm still going to miss you," he said, and Shanks laughed. "You better." He turned towards the kids who were watching him before smiling at them. "We didn't get to talk much with everything that happened. I've heard a lot about you both from Luffy. I'm leaving him in your care," he said, and Ace and Sabo's eyes widened before they attempted to not look embarrassed. "We'll take care of him," Ace said, grinning up at Shanks, who returned it as a spark of recognition passed through his eyes, and he looked at Ace a little bit longer. "What's your name, kid?" Shanks asked Ace, who now studied the man, his smile dropping quickly. "xXDia-RoseXx," he said, and Shanks' eyes lit up in excitement as a memory of a beautiful woman flashed through his mind and a dark-haired captain who loved that girl. "What a nice strong name you have, kid." And with that he turned and left. Ace just looked at him in confusion. What did the man know? "Aka Gammy," Marco shouted out suddenly, making him stop and turn back towards them. "I owe you for this, thank you for saving him, Yui," he said truthfully. "Then why don't you?" he started, but Marco's eye twitched before he shouted. "Never." Shanks laughed and waved goodbye. He was telling Luffy the truth. That morning he would give up Heist meant that the kid could survive to see another day. Heck, he'd give up his life for that kid, and he got to see something interesting. xXDia. He recognized that name. The lover of his captain shared that name. Ace did look a lot like her, but shared Roger's dark hair and eyes. "I wonder just how the world will change with them as siblings." Shanks laughed. A brotherhood of D's, the world would never be the same, and Shanks couldn't wait to see that. It was raining out and had been for the past few days. "I'm bored." Luffy whined into the dinner table, putting his head against it, annoyed with the rain. "We'll be out of the area soon enough. Try and be positive, Lou," Thatch said, collecting some of the dishes that were left over from lunch. "I want to be out of it now," he whined louder. Luffy, who was 8 years old, wanted to play on his beloved deck, and when it rained not even Pops sat outside. "Well, too bad, kid, you and water don't mix well, so you're stuck in here till it's all over with." And with that, Thatch went back into the kitchen to start on his dishes, and with the amount of siblings on this ship, the dishes were plenty. If he wasn't careful, he could be washing dishes all day. At this point in time, though, Luffy was getting frustrated. He wanted to go out and play, not be stuck inside the galley all day. Sabo was reading a book he had gotten from Naruto about navigation, and Ace was heading to the kitchen to talk with Thatch, but secretly wouldn't mind helping him with the dishes. Marco was in his own room finishing up work that needed to be done, and Pops was resting in his room. The rain sometimes made Pops feel a little sick and sore, so the nurses were all over making him rest on those days. All of the commanders were doing something to occupy their time. Well, all except one. Luffy saw Aizu sitting in his spot at the dinner table, a cup of coffee beside him and paper and a pen in front of him. Luffy had no one else to visit, so he snuck up quietly and gave the cross-dresser a big hug. Luffy? He said in surprise. He was so into his drawing that he didn't hear the kid coming towards him. Luffy smiled widely and climbed onto his lap. What cha drawn? He asked, looking down at the picture, not sure what all of the arrows and numbers meant, but Aizu smiled at the kid. I'm drawing the design for some new clothes. The crew can't keep wearing the same things forever, kid. Luffy laughed with his brother since he liked getting new clothes from him. Next time you should draw something I can wear in the rain. Luffy laughed, then pouted, remembering that it was still raining and wanting it to end quickly. Aizu looked at the boy for a moment curiously before a smile came to his face. I think I might have something to help you out there, brat. Aizu said with a smile, picking the kid up and walking off towards him, Rune taking the longer route to avoid the rain. Aizu, being the one to make the clothing for the crew, had everything and anything for, just in case, problems and sudden inspiration moments. He couldn't help but smile wider, as this was going to be one of those special times. Sitting Luffy down on his bed, he went to work grabbing everything and anything he might need from their properly placed spots in his room. Strips of rubber cloth and warm padding underneath. He started to sew together at an amazing speed the fabrics, creating a bright rubber coat. Luffy, here is a new jacket for you. He smiled and held up the coat. It was red in color with a small lion growling at the bottom of it. Aizu added that for an extra touch. With this on, you'll keep dry from the rain. Luffy jumped on the bed and reached for the mystery coat. He absolutely loved it. Aizu helped him put it on before putting one on himself over his kimono and picking up a large umbrella and a smaller one from a cabinet in the corner of his room. We can only play at a certain spot on the ship to avoid the waves, okay, Luffy? Luffy nodded his head and followed his brother out onto the deck. This part of the deck was surrounded by walls and further away from the railing, so Aizu figured he would be safe here from the roaring waves. The rain was falling, but as Thatch said, they were moving out of that area, so the rain should stop soon enough. Luffy jumped around and splashed in the puddles, his laughter ringing across the loud waves, his umbrella being held over his head with his small hands. Luffy loved this. Aizu smiled watching the kid playing around in the rain. It was times like this that remind him how Luffy brought such an innocence to the ship that was never there before. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the times when Luffy wasn't on the ship, but found he could no longer. Luffy completed this crew in a way they didn't think possible. Him and those brats. Aizu, come play with me. Luffy had dropped his umbrella and was reaching his hand out to the older brother. Aizu grinned and took the little hand before splashing in a large puddle, sending water towards the kid, who giggled and splashed back. The two played like this for an hour before Marco came out of his room to check if the rain had stopped yet. He looked around and his eyes widened a bit, seeing both Luffy and Aizu soaking wet and laughing loudly. Marco couldn't help the smile that came to his own face at the scene. Turning back to his room, he walked to his table, pulled a camera from his drawer and walked towards the brothers to get the moment dointed for the old man. Once finished taking the picture, Marco put the camera away and saw Thatch watching from the galley doorway with a smile on his own face. It's nice to see them like this, Thatch said with a smile. It's weird to see Aizu playing in the rain. Normally the man hates anything that could ruin his hair or makeup, Yui. Marco said, returning the smile. Luffy gets what he wants when he wants it. Thatch replied with a shrug. It was a known fact for the crew. The rain had all but stopped now and the two brothers were smiling even though they were soaked. This was the most fun Aizu had had in a while, so he was now glad Luffy had come to sit on his lap this afternoon. Aizu, look. Luffy got the cross-dresser's attention by pointing at the rainbow that was now shining in the sky. They smiled as the rain had passed. Go get yourselves dried off, Yui. Marco said, climbing down now to visit the two. I don't want you to get sick again, Luffy, so make sure you take a hot bath as well, Yui. Luffy whined at the thought of having to take a bath, but Aizu patted him on the shoulder. I'll take it with you. Sound okay, brat? Aizu grinned at him and Luffy grinned back, guessing it was alright to have a bath with his big brother. Marco and Thatch smiled at the exchange between the two, happy to see them both having fun as the sun started to shine brightly. Line break. It was midnight when Pops heard a knock on his door. He could sense it was his youngest son, so he beckoned him in. What's wrong, my son? He asked, hearing the sniffles coming from the kid, alerting the older man that Luffy was crying. I had a bad dream, he said, climbing up onto the older man's chest and lying down. Do you want to talk about it? He questioned while rubbing the kid's back soothingly. Thatch was eaten by a big monster, he said, and closed his eyes, afraid the monster would come back. What kind of monster? He asked Luffy, who kept his eyes closed. Pops kept rubbing his back softly. A mean scary one that ate Thatch and then ate Ace. He said, his voice choking up from tears that might come again. Shish, it's all right Luffy, no one can hurt you here. There isn't a monster in this world I can't protect this family from. Whitebeard said soothingly, and Luffy looked up at him with hopeful eyes. Your brothers are very strong, so have faith in them, all right? He said and began to hum for the boy. Luffy listened, hugging the old man tight and falling asleep on his chest. When Marco woke up and didn't find Luffy in his room, panic surged through his veins. What if the kid got up in the middle of the night, slipped and fell of the ship? What if he drowned while everyone was asleep? What if his brother was dead? Marco by this point in time had put himself into a small panic that Thatch had to slap him on the back to get him to calm down. If he's not with you and not with me, he's probably with Pops. Thatch said, rolling his eyes and pushing Marco into the general direction towards Pop's room. Marco may be a fearless pirate who has fought and won many battles on this sea, but if you add Luffy into this equation, he mother hen that can't function unless he knows his brother is safe. Ace and Sabo had figured that Luffy went to sleep with one of the commanders that night, since that was a normal occurrence for them. Luffy would decide at dinner he wanted to cuddle with Marco and he would get what he wanted, so they weren't that surprised to wake up and find him gone. Marco knocked on Pop's door and heard him call for them to enter. When they did enter and saw Luffy still deeply asleep on his chest while the older man was humming happily, they couldn't help but smile. Has he been here all night, Yoi? Marco asked quietly, trying not to wake the sleeping child. Since midnight or so, he got in reply. Thatch raised his eyebrow in question. Why didn't the kid come to one of them? He had a nightmare. That answered one of their questions. Now they had more. Did he tell you what it was about? Thatch asked, pulling up a chair in his Pop's room, Marco following along. Ah, he said he saw a monster eat both you and Ace. He said, looking towards Thatch. This caught his attention from an earlier memory. He's still having that nightmare? Thatch asked. Even Marco was concerned because he had heard about this nightmare once before. He has had this already? Whitebeard asked his elder sons. He came to me one night saying he had a nightmare of me being eaten by a dark monster. You said he now sees Ace being eaten as well? Thatch asked, worry in his voice. Yes, he mentioned Ace being eaten as well. All fell silent for a moment, taking in this information. He's inquisitive. He senses things in people that we sometimes miss. Thatch said, slowly thinking of the times Luffy had seen the good in most people and sometimes seeing the bad. His own mind thinking back to Teach and the way Luffy never is comfortable near him but dismissing it quickly. Teach is one of their brothers, nothing to need worrying about there. But as far as we know, Luffy can't predict the future, so this dream could be just that, a dream, Yoi. Marco said, pointing out the obvious. We'll keep an eye on him, but keep guard in case. Thatch. Pop said something had been feeling weird lately. The world was beginning to change, but he wasn't sure if it was a good change or a bad one yet. Luffy slowly began to open his eyes and saw the room with his two brothers and father awake. Good yawn morning, he said, which was quite cute to the men in the room. Good morning, Luffy. Did you sleep well, Yoi? Marco asked, sitting on the edge of the bed to talk with him better. It's comfy here. Pops can chase away all monsters, right, Pops? Luffy gave his wide smile towards the man who returned it. Of course, brat. Luffy got up off of Whitebeard and climbed into Marco's arms. Is breakfast ready? He looked towards Thatch, who gave his smile. What a silly question, bud. Let's go eat. And with a loud cheer, Luffy was out of Marco's lap and dragging Thatch towards the kitchen. I'm glad he's feeling energetic, Yoi. Marco smiled watching them go. I pity the poor fool who gets coaxed into being his chief, Gura. Pops laughed. So do I, Yoi. And they both got up and headed for the galley before Luffy ate everything on the tables. Marco was still worried for his brother but chose to just keep watch for now. If any monsters appeared on this ship, he'd deal with them personally, his eyes flashing icy blue, sealing the promise in his heart.